Blizzards tore across the outskirts of Moscow as German tanks crushed forests and infantry clashed in frozen villages, each step paid for in blood. Snow and ice flew as soldiers in tattered uniforms charged through waist-deep snow, dodging artillery shells and gunfire, their breath visible in the icy air. Tanks rumbled forward, leveling trees and burning villages, while machine gun fire shattered the silence of the winter morning. Civilians and soldiers alike braved frostbite, starvation, and relentless bombardment, yet the spirit of defiance refused to break. This was not just a battle. It was the turning point where Hitler's advance met the first real Soviet resistance, and ordinary men and women became legends defending their capital. Tonight, you will journey through the entire story of the Battle of Moscow, step by step, soldier by soldier, decision by decision. To understand the scale of the battle that would unfold at its gates, one must first grasp what the city represented to both Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. For Hitler, Moscow was not merely a city. It was the symbol of Soviet power, the nerve center of its railways, industry, and politics. It was the capital from which Stalin directed his vast empire, the place where the Communist Party had its seat and where the Red Army took its orders. To seize Moscow would not only cripple the Soviet war effort, it would strike at the very idea of the Soviet Union itself. In Hitler's eyes, Moscow was the jewel that would complete Operation Barbarossa, the crown of his great crusade in the East. The fall of Moscow, he believed, would shatter Soviet resistance, bring the war to an end before winter, and open the endless lands of Russia to German conquest and colonization. For Stalin, Moscow was more than the capital. It was the sacred heart of Russia, the successor to centuries of empire, the city of the Kremlin towers and onion domes, of palaces and factories, of poets and revolutionaries. To lose Moscow was to lose everything. In the mind of the Soviet people, Moscow was Russia, and Russia was Moscow. If the city fell, the Soviet state would be decapitated. Its railways converged there, like veins to a heart. Its ministries, its generals, its propaganda, its morale, all pulsed outward from the capital. Stalin understood this as keenly as Hitler. For him, the defense of Moscow was not only a matter of military necessity, it was a matter of survival. By the summer of 1941, the stakes were clear. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22nd, had torn into the Soviet Union with unprecedented ferocity. 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces, poured across the border in the largest invasion in history. The German war machine advanced in 3 great thrusts, north toward Leningrad, south into Ukraine, and in the center toward Moscow. The Central Army Group, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, had been tasked with the most decisive blow to strike across the plains of western Russia, crush the Red Army, and capture the Soviet capital. As the Wehrmacht surged eastward, cities fell like dominoes. Minsk, Smolensk, Bryansk, each one swallowed in fire and ruin. Millions of Soviet soldiers were encircled, captured, or killed. Villages burned, roads clogged with refugees, and the once proud Red Army staggered under the hammer blows of German blitzkrieg. Hitler was convinced that Moscow would fall within weeks. His generals, flushed with victory, saw the capital as the prize that would deliver final triumph. They believed the war in the East would be over before the first snows of winter. But Moscow was not just another objective on a map. It was a fortress of the mind. In the Kremlin, Stalin refused to abandon his city. The Soviet leader, so recently shaken by the scale of the German invasion, now steeled himself. He ordered factories dismantled and moved to the Urals, far beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe. He demanded fresh armies be raised from every corner of the Soviet Union, and he declared that Moscow would not, must not, and could not fall. The city itself prepared for war. Its people dug trenches on the outskirts, built barricades in the streets, and fashioned anti-tank obstacles from steel and concrete. Women and children labored with picks and shovels, side by side with soldiers. From the towers of the Kremlin to the furthest factories on the city's edge, Moscow became a fortress, bracing for the storm. For Hitler, the capture of Moscow promised glory, dominance, and the swift conclusion of his most ambitious campaign. For Stalin, its defense would be a test of will, a struggle not only for land, but for the survival of his regime, his people, and his vision of the Soviet future. Thus, the stage was set. Two titans, two ideologies, two visions of the world collided in their obsession with a single city. The fate of millions would turn upon the outcome. The gates of Moscow stood waiting for the armies of Hitler to come, and for the Red Army to decide whether the heart of Russia would beat on or be silenced beneath the iron tread of the Wehrmacht. In the early hours of June 22, 1941, the quiet along the German-Soviet frontier shattered beneath a thunderclap of artillery, tanks, and aircraft. It was the opening act of Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion the world had ever seen. But to truly grasp the enormity of what was unleashed, we must step back into the dark corridors of Adolf Hitler's imagination, into the dream, no, the obsession that drove him eastward. For Hitler, the Soviet Union was never merely a neighbouring power. It was, in his eyes, the embodiment of everything he despised: Bolshevism, Slavic peoples, and above all, the Jewish influence he believed lay at the heart of communism. In Mein Kampf, written long before he grasped the levers of power, Hitler had outlined his vision of Lebensraum, living space for the German people. The fertile plains of Ukraine, the oil of the Caucasus, the endless expanses of Russia, these, he believed, were destined to become the breadbasket and lifeblood of a greater German Reich. But Moscow, the political and psychological core of the Soviet state, stood in his path. Barbarossa was not conceived as an ordinary war. It was envisioned as a war of annihilation, a struggle of race and ideology. Unlike France, unlike Poland, the Soviet Union was to be dismantled, gutted, and rebuilt as a colonial frontier for Germany. Its people were to be enslaved, starved, or exterminated. Its culture erased, its resources plundered. The German soldier marching east was not told he was fighting another army. He was told he was fighting a subhuman enemy, one unworthy of mercy. In Hitler's words, the campaign was to be waged with unprecedented, unmerciful, and unrelenting harshness. By the spring of 1941, the dream had taken form in maps, timetables, and orders. The Wehrmacht's high command assembled the most formidable strike force ever seen. Nearly 3 million men, supported by more than 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and over 2,500 aircraft. They would be deployed across a front stretching nearly 2,000 kilometers. 3 massive army groups would plunge into the Soviet Union. Army Group North toward Leningrad, Army Group South into Ukraine, and at the center, Army Group Center aimed directly at Moscow. The planners in Berlin believed the war would be short, sharp, and decisive. They looked back on the spectacular campaigns of 1939 and 1940, Poland crushed in weeks, France humbled in mere months, and assumed the Soviet Union would collapse just as easily. The Red Army, still scarred from Stalin's purges of the 1930s, was dismissed as poorly led, poorly equipped, and incapable of modern war. The Soviet people, so the Nazis believed, despised their own regime and would welcome German troops as liberators. All calculations pointed to the same conclusion: Moscow could be reached and captured within 3 or 4 months. But beneath this confidence lay arrogance. Hitler and his generals underestimated the sheer scale of the Soviet Union, the resilience of its people, and the brutality of its climate. They convinced themselves that one swift campaign, one summer's offensive, could destroy an empire that stretched across 11 time zones. They ignored the warnings of those who spoke of Russia's vast distances, its endless reserves of manpower, its capacity to endure hardship. They believed their own myth, that Blitzkrieg was unstoppable, and that history itself bent to the will of the Führer. The name of the operation carried its own symbolism. Barbarossa, after Frederick Barbarossa, the medieval Holy Roman Emperor, a figure steeped in German legend. It was a name chosen to conjure glory, conquest, and destiny. To Hitler, the campaign was not just a military undertaking. It was a crusade, a clash of civilizations. It was the chance to topple what he called the Jewish Bolshevik Colossus and secure the future of the German Reich for 1,000 years. Yet within this dream, there was a fatal blindness. By envisioning Barbarossa as a war of extermination, Hitler guaranteed a resistance fiercer than anything his armies had yet encountered. By dismissing the Soviets as weak, he planted the seeds of his own failure. By believing Moscow could fall like Warsaw or Paris, he marched his men into a storm they could not imagine. And so, on that June morning, the dream became reality. Columns of tanks surged across the border. The Luftwaffe rained destruction from the skies. Villages and cities burned as millions of German soldiers moved eastward. To the men of the Wehrmacht, it seemed as if history was theirs to command, as if the fall of Moscow and the collapse of the Soviet Union were foregone conclusions. But history does not bend so easily, and the dream of Barbarossa, so bold and so ruthless, would soon meet the brutal test of reality on the road to Moscow. The night was warm and still along the western frontier of the Soviet Union. In the villages of Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states, peasants slept in their wooden homes, unaware of the storm that was gathering. Soviet border troops patrolled in silence, weary but unsuspecting, their rifles slung over their shoulders. To them, June 21st was just another day of tension on a frontier that had grown uneasy but not yet violent. Then, in the early hours of June 22nd, 1941, the world changed. At 3:15 in the morning, the horizon erupted in fire. The thunder of artillery rolled across hundreds of miles. Searchlights pierced the night as German guns unleashed a barrage of unimaginable scale. The ground shook, windows shattered, and men were thrown from their bunks by the violence of the opening salvo. Above, the sky filled with the droning of engines. The Luftwaffe, Hitler's air arm, swept across the border in wave after wave. Thousands of aircraft poured into Soviet airspace, their targets carefully chosen: airfields, command posts, communication hubs, and supply depots. Within hours, entire squadrons of Soviet planes were burning on the ground, destroyed before they could even take off. By the end of the day, nearly 1,500 Soviet aircraft had been obliterated, most of them still lined neatly in rows on their runways. On the ground, the Wehrmacht surged forward. 3 million German soldiers, supported by 600,000 vehicles and 75,000 horses, poured across a front stretching from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. This was not a limited attack. It was a full-scale invasion, the largest in human history. 3 vast army groups, north, centre and south, advanced with a precision that reflected months of planning. Tanks rolled forward in endless columns, dust rising in their wake. Infantry pressed behind them, while engineers built bridges across rivers choked with smoke and flame. For the Soviet defenders, the assault was more than a military onslaught. It was a betrayal. Just 2 years earlier, Hitler and Stalin had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that had stunned the world. To Stalin, it was a guarantee of time to rebuild the Red Army, time to secure Soviet borders, time to prepare for war that he knew would one day come. And yet, despite numerous warnings from spies, diplomats, and his own generals, Stalin refused to believe Hitler would strike in 1941. He dismissed reports of German build-ups as provocations. He even punished those who raised alarms, fearing they might drag him into a premature war. Thus, when the attack came, the Soviet Union was caught in a state of paralysis. Entire divisions were encamped dangerously close to the border, unfortified, unprepared, and forbidden from taking defensive measures that might provoke the Germans. Ammunition was locked away, artillery pieces unmanned, aircraft neatly parked in lines, easy prey for the Luftwaffe's bombs. Confusion reigned in the early hours of June 22nd. Soviet units reported German bombardments to their superiors, only to be met with disbelief. Commanders hesitated, uncertain whether this was war or some accidental border clash. In Moscow, Stalin himself was stunned. For hours he refused to issue a formal declaration of war, unable or unwilling to accept that Hitler had torn apart their fragile pact. But there was no mistaking the truth. Across the vast frontier, German spearheads smashed through Soviet lines. In Lithuania and Latvia, Army Group North advanced toward the Baltic states. In Ukraine, Army Group South surged toward Kiev. And at the centre, Field Marshal von Bock's Army Group Centre drove east toward Minsk and Smolensk, the great highway to Moscow. The Soviet soldiers on the front lines faced impossible odds. Many fought bravely, desperately, firing back with rifles against tanks and aircraft. Border guards held out in isolated posts until they were overrun or annihilated. Entire regiments were surrounded within days, swallowed by the speed of the German advance. Tens of thousands were captured before they even knew a war had begun. For civilians, the invasion came like a nightmare. Villages woke to the scream of Stuka dive bombers, their sirens wailing as bombs fell on marketplaces, rail stations, and homes. Families fled into the forests, carts laden with whatever belongings they could grab in moments. The sky was filled with smoke and the air with panic. For millions of ordinary men, women, and children, June 22nd was the beginning of years of suffering, occupation, and survival under a war of extermination. By nightfall, the scale of the disaster was evident. German columns had penetrated dozens of miles into Soviet territory. The Red Army had suffered staggering losses in men and machines. Entire sectors of the front were collapsing. The illusion of peace, the fragile security of the pact with Hitler, had been shattered forever. June 22, 1941, was not just another day of battle. It was the turning point of the century, the moment the Second World War transformed into a truly global struggle. Hitler's armies had launched their crusade against the Soviet Union, and Stalin's empire now stood in the path of annihilation. The day of betrayal had dawned, and the fate of Moscow, of the Soviet Union, and of millions upon millions of lives now hung in the balance. In the first weeks of the invasion, the world witnessed the terrifying power of blitzkrieg, the German art of lightning war. It was not merely a military tactic, it was a carefully choreographed storm, a fusion of speed, precision, and overwhelming force, designed to break armies and shatter nations before they could even mount a defense. Across the Western Soviet Union, this storm now raged. German tanks, sleek, fast, and deadly, led the charge. They were the spearheads of vast armoured divisions, thrusting deep into Soviet territory, bypassing strong points, cutting roads, and encircling entire armies in great steel claws. Behind them came the motorized infantry, riding trucks and half-tracks, their rifles and machine guns ready to secure the ground the panzers had ripped open. Overhead, the Luftwaffe ruled the skies, pounding Soviet columns, strafing retreating troops, and destroying bridges and railways to cripple any hope of reinforcement. It was a symphony of destruction, perfected in Poland, in France, and in the Balkans, now unleashed on a scale dwarfing anything before. In just days, the Wehrmacht advanced faster and farther than most armies could dream in months. Roads clogged with burning vehicles and shattered regiments marked their path. Soviet soldiers, stunned by the ferocity of the attack, fell back in disarray, often without orders, without communication, and without hope. By the end of the first week, German spearheads had already pushed hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory. In the north, Army Group North rolled through Lithuania and Latvia, driving relentlessly toward Leningrad. In the south, Army Group South surged across the rich fields of Ukraine, one of Hitler's most coveted prizes, and in the center, the most powerful thrust of all, Army Group Center, smashed through Belarus. Their destination, Moscow, the beating heart of the Soviet Union. The scale of Soviet losses defied imagination. In massive encirclements at Minsk and later at Smolensk, entire Soviet armies were swallowed whole. Tens of thousands of soldiers were trapped in steel pincers, cut off from supply and reinforcement. Some fought desperately in the forests and marshes, and others tried to break free in scattered groups. Most were forced to surrender. In the first 3 weeks alone, over 600,000 Soviet troops were taken prisoner. Columns of men, weary and starving, stretched for miles along the roads, guarded by German soldiers who themselves were astonished by the sheer number of captives. And still the advance pressed on. Soviet defences crumbled before the onslaught. Communications collapsed. Whole fronts disappeared into chaos. Tanks that had once been proudly displayed in parades now lay smouldering on the battlefield, their crews dead or captured. Artillery was abandoned in the mud. Airfields were littered with the wreckage of planes destroyed before they could even lift off the ground. Yet Blitzkrieg was not only about firepower, it was about psychology. The speed of the German advance created terror and confusion. Civilians, waking to the roar of engines and the crack of gunfire, could scarcely comprehend what was happening. Refugees clogged the roads, mingling with retreating soldiers, their carts piled high with possessions, their faces etched with fear. Entire towns vanished beneath flames as the Wehrmacht pressed eastward, leaving only blackened ruins in its wake. For Hitler, these victories seemed to confirm his prophecy. The Red Army, so often mocked as a lumbering giant of poorly trained peasants, appeared to collapse like a house of cards. The speed of the German advance seemed unstoppable, the Soviet Union destined to fall within weeks. In Berlin, propaganda trumpeted glorious victories, proclaiming the collapse of Bolshevism. Officers of the Wehrmacht, seasoned by earlier campaigns, whispered among themselves that Moscow could be theirs before autumn. But beneath the triumph, the seeds of strain were already taking root. The distances grew longer, the supply lines more fragile. The roads of Russia were rough and few, turning to choking dust in summer and soon to a quagmire in rain. Fuel trucks struggled to keep pace with the armoured columns. Horses, still the backbone of German logistics, stumbled and died along the endless march. The Wehrmacht had launched its greatest gamble, and in these first weeks, the gamble seemed to pay off. But every kilometre east stretched their strength thinner. Every day pushed them further from the certainty of supply and reinforcement. Still, in June and July of 1941, none of this mattered to the German High Command. What mattered was momentum, and momentum was theirs. From the Baltic to the Black Sea, the unstoppable tide of blitzkrieg surged forward. Town after town fell, army after army was shattered, and the road to Moscow seemed wide open. But the Soviet Union was not yet finished. Though stunned, bleeding and broken, it had not collapsed. And soon, the German tide, so swift and so destructive, would find itself meeting resistance fiercer than it had ever imagined. The first weeks of Operation Barbarossa were not merely a retreat for the Soviet Union. They were a catastrophe on a scale almost beyond comprehension. Entire armies ceased to exist, swallowed by the relentless jaws of German encirclement. The once mighty Red Army, numbering millions, seemed to dissolve before the precision and speed of the Wehrmacht's assault. The frontiers of the Soviet Union, drawn so confidently on maps, collapsed into chaos, smoke and ruin. The first great disaster came at Minsk. Within days of the invasion, German panzer groups under the command of Generals Hermann Hoth and Heinz Guderian raced deep into Belarus, thrusting far beyond the Soviet front lines. Their tanks moved like arrows cutting through cloth, tearing gaps wide open. Behind them, infantry divisions sealed the breaches, encircling Soviet forces that had been caught off guard and left vulnerable by Stalin's refusal to authorize timely withdrawals. The trap closed with brutal efficiency. Entire Soviet armies, the 3rd, the 10th, and parts of the 4th, found themselves surrounded west of Minsk. Cut off from supplies, communications severed, they fought desperately in the forests and marshes, attempting breakout after breakout, each more hopeless than the last. Columns of exhausted men staggered eastward, only to be driven back by German machine gun fire. Ammunition ran dry, rations disappeared, and soldiers resorted to eating grass and bark as they tried to hold their ground. By the end of June, over 3,000 Soviet soldiers had been captured in the Minsk pocket. The road to Smolensk and beyond it, Moscow, now lay wide open, but the nightmare did not end there. Barely had the Germans absorbed their victory at Minsk when the next great encirclement unfolded at Smolensk. Once again, German armoured spearheads plunged forward, racing eastward, while Soviet forces scrambled to plug the widening gaps. In July, Guderian's panzers swept south from Vitebsk, while Hoth's forces pressed from the north. The pincers met east of Smolensk, cutting off another vast segment of the Red Army. This time, the Soviets resisted with extraordinary ferocity. Entire divisions dug into the forests and villages, fighting to the last bullet. For weeks, vicious battles raged inside the pocket. Soviet soldiers staged breakout attempts in every direction, while partisans harassed German supply lines in the surrounding countryside. The struggle was so fierce that the Germans themselves began to feel the cost of their rapid advance. Supply shortages grew worse, fuel was rationed, and the men of the Wehrmacht realized that each victory came with an ever higher price. Yet despite this resistance, the outcome was the same. By the time the Smolensk pocket was finally reduced in late July, another 3,200 Soviet troops had been taken prisoner. Thousands more lay dead in the fields and forests. The scale of destruction was staggering. In just 2 months, the Red Army had lost more than 2 million men, killed, wounded, or captured. The very foundations of Soviet military power seemed to disintegrate before the German advance. Everywhere, the collapse of the frontiers told the same story. Divisions shattered, commanders cut off, soldiers wandering aimlessly through the countryside in search of units that no longer existed. Tanks were abandoned for lack of fuel. Artillery pieces were left in ditches. Entire air regiments vanished without a trace, their aircraft destroyed on the ground before they ever had the chance to fly. The human cost was equally harrowing. Long columns of Soviet prisoners, gaunt and weary, trudged westward under guard. They marched without food, without water, their uniforms in tatters, their faces hollow with despair. For many, captivity meant a slow death. The German High Command, regarding Soviet soldiers as subhuman, made little provision for their care. By winter, hundreds of thousands of these men would perish from hunger, disease, and exposure in the camps of the Reich. And yet, amid the wreckage, something remarkable began to stir. Though the front lines crumbled and cities fell, the Soviet Union did not collapse. New armies were raised, sometimes with barely trained conscripts, sometimes with old men and teenagers handed rifles. Industry, driven eastward beyond the Urals, began to produce new weapons and machines. Stalin, shaken but unbroken, refused to concede. The Red Army bled, but it fought on. For the Germans, the victories at Minsk and Smolensk seemed to prove the inevitability of their triumph. They had destroyed army after army, advanced hundreds of miles, and inflicted losses no enemy could possibly endure. To many in the Wehrmacht, Moscow seemed within their grasp. Yet the cost of these victories, and the vast distances still to be crossed, whispered a warning that few chose to hear. The collapse of the Red Army's frontiers was real, and it was devastating, but it was not the end. Instead, it marked the beginning of a struggle that would stretch far beyond the expectations of Hitler and his generals. The road to Moscow, though open, was long, and the Soviet Union, battered and bleeding, was not yet finished. After the catastrophe of Minsk, the road to Moscow appeared wide open. German officers boasted that their panzers would soon be rolling across Red Square. The collapse of the Soviet frontier armies seemed total, the Wehrmacht's advance unstoppable. Yet as the German spearheads surged deeper into Russia, the landscape itself and the resilience of the Soviet people began to reveal the first cracks in the myth of invincibility. On the long road to Smolensk, the Germans encountered resistance that, for the first time, forced them to slow, to struggle, and to bleed. Smolensk, an ancient city on the banks of the Dnieper River, was more than a name on a map. It was the gateway to Moscow, the great fortress that guarded the central highway. Whoever controlled Smolensk controlled the most direct route to the Soviet capital. German generals knew it, and so did Stalin. To the Soviets, Smolensk was the shield before Moscow's heart. If it fell quickly, the Germans might seize the capital before the Red Army could recover. If it could be held, even briefly, the tide of the invasion might yet be slowed. In July 1941, as Army Group Center advanced eastward, the battle for Smolensk erupted. German panzers under Generals Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth pressed forward in sweeping arcs, their goal to encircle Soviet forces once again. The Soviets, already battered by the disasters of Minsk, were desperate to halt the tide. New armies were thrown into the fight, armies raised in haste, filled with fresh recruits, poorly equipped, yet burning with determination. For weeks, the fields, forests, and villages around Smolensk became a cauldron of fire. The Soviets fought with a ferocity that shocked the Wehrmacht. Entire divisions dug into the woods, refusing to surrender even when surrounded. Soviet counterattacks, often clumsy and costly, slammed into the German lines again and again, slowing their advance. Young officers who had barely completed their training led charges with bayonets fixed. Artillery batteries fired until their barrels glowed red. Soviet pilots, hopelessly outnumbered, flung themselves into the skies, ramming German aircraft when their ammunition ran out. The fighting around Smolensk was brutal and unrelenting. Villages changed hands several times in a single day. Civilians fled into the forests as their homes were consumed by flames. Roads were clogged not only with retreating soldiers, but with refugees, women, children, and the elderly, trying to escape the maelstrom, only to find themselves caught in its path. Everywhere, the dead littered the ground. Soviet soldiers who had stood their ground to the last, German troops cut down in the assaults, civilians killed in the crossfire. The stench of smoke and decay hung heavy in the summer air. Despite the ferocity of Soviet resistance, the Germans eventually achieved another encirclement. By late July, vast numbers of Soviet troops were trapped around Smolensk. Once again, German pincers closed, capturing nearly 300,000 men. To Berlin, it appeared another stunning victory had been achieved. Yet beneath the headlines of triumph lay a more complicated truth. Unlike Minsk, Smolensk had not fallen quickly or easily. The battle had consumed precious time, more than 2 weeks of hard fighting. German losses were significant, their supply lines strained, their panzers worn down by constant combat. For the first time, the Wehrmacht realized the Soviet Union was not collapsing with the speed of France or Poland, and for Stalin, Smolensk offered a glimmer of hope. Though hundreds of thousands of his soldiers had been lost, they had bought something priceless: time. Time to mobilize new armies, time to move factories deeper into the east, time to prepare the defenses of Moscow. The Soviet High Command began to understand that the German blitzkrieg, devastating though it was, could be resisted, not stopped outright, but slowed, delayed, blunted. Smolensk also marked the rise of new Soviet commanders. Among them was General Georgy Zhukov, whose organizational brilliance and ruthless determination began to shine. Though not yet the savior of Moscow, Zhukov was already earning a reputation as the man capable of imposing order on chaos, of rallying broken units into coherent defense. His role at Smolensk would foreshadow the pivotal part he would later play in the battle for the capital. For the Germans, the victory at Smolensk carried a bitter aftertaste. Yes, another vast Soviet force had been destroyed. Yes, the road to Moscow was open once more. But the Red Army had shown it could recover, regroup, and fight with tenacity that defied Hitler's expectations. The Germans had reached the threshold of Moscow's defenses, but they were no longer advancing at lightning speed. The momentum of June had begun to slow, and with it the certainty of a swift victory began to waver. The road to Smolensk was paved with fire and sacrifice. It was here that the German dream of an easy march to Moscow first encountered the reality of Soviet endurance. And though the city itself would fall, the delay it imposed would echo through the months ahead. The clock was ticking, and each passing day brought the Wehrmacht closer to the Russian autumn, the rains, and the dreaded winter that lay beyond. The first weeks of Operation Barbarossa were not merely a test of armies and machines. They were a test of the Soviet state itself, its leadership, its command structure, its very will to survive. At the heart of this crisis stood Joseph Stalin, the dictator who only months earlier had assured his people that Hitler would never dare attack. On the morning of June 22, 1941, when reports of the German invasion began flooding Moscow, Stalin did not immediately believe them. Even as Luftwaffe bombs struck Soviet airfields and armored spearheads poured across the frontier, he suspected that rogue generals or diplomatic provocateurs were at work. This hesitation, born of denial, wasted precious hours as chaos spread across the front. The paralysis at the top was magnified by the legacy of Stalin's own hand. In the late 1930s, fearful of rivals, he had unleashed the Great Purge upon the Red Army. Thousands of officers, marshals, generals, colonels, men with hard-earned experience from the Russian Civil War and beyond were executed or sent to the gulags. What remained was a shell of a command hierarchy. Ambitious yet inexperienced officers elevated overnight, terrified of making independent decisions lest they incur Stalin's wrath. As the Wehrmacht advanced, this institutional wound proved catastrophic. Communication broke down, decisions were delayed, and too often commanders chose to await orders from Moscow rather than act on the realities unfolding before them. In those early weeks, the High Command, known as the Stavka, reeled under the sheer scale of disaster. Frontline units vanished in encirclements, air forces were annihilated on the ground, and German panzers drove deeper and deeper into Soviet territory. Stalin, at first stunned into silence, soon lashed out with ferocity. His orders were desperate, draconian, and often divorced from reality. Generals were commanded to hold positions at all costs, regardless of flanking maneuvers that threatened to surround them. Retreat was declared treason. Defeat was blamed not on German superiority, but on cowardice, incompetence, and betrayal. In the fevered atmosphere, commanders were shot for failing to hold impossible lines, and political commissars were dispatched to enforce loyalty through fear rather than strategy. Behind closed doors, Stalin himself wrestled with despair. Some accounts suggest that in late June, for a brief moment, he even considered resigning his leadership. He withdrew to his dacha outside Moscow, where aides found him unshaven, silent, and despondent. But this weakness was short-lived. By the first days of July, Stalin re-emerged with grim resolve. He declared the war a great patriotic war, appealing to the deepest reserves of Russian nationalism and sacrifice. His personal terror had shifted into ruthless determination, and with it came an iron grip over military decision-making. Yet the chaos of those early months lingered. Coordination between fronts was poor, reserves were hurled piecemeal into battle, and trust between the Kremlin and the army remained poisoned by paranoia. The purges of yesterday had crippled the Red Army of today, and so, while Soviet soldiers fought with courage, they often did so under the shadow of disarray at the top, where fear, suspicion, and desperation ruled the halls of power in Moscow. This was the state of Soviet high command as the Wehrmacht surged eastward, shaken by surprise, crippled by its own self-inflicted wounds, and struggling to transform panic into strategy. Yet from this chaos, a transformation was beginning, one that would, in time, turn the tide of war. By the late summer of 1941, with the Wehrmacht deep inside Soviet territory, Berlin was awash with optimism. The Nazi leadership, intoxicated by weeks of stunning victories, believed that the fall of Moscow was not only possible but inevitable. German newspapers printed triumphant maps showing the rapid advance across the Western Soviet Union, and Hitler himself proclaimed that the Red Army was finished. In the mind of the Führer, Moscow, the heart of Soviet communications, industry, and political power, was within his grasp before the autumn rains would fall. The reasoning seemed sound, at least on the surface. In just weeks, German forces had accomplished what no army before them had managed. Minsk had fallen, Smolensk had been reached, and hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops had been encircled and captured. Luftwaffe reconnaissance revealed Soviet columns in retreat, disorganized and bleeding. Hitler and his generals viewed these developments as proof that their blitzkrieg doctrine was unstoppable, a repeat of their triumphs in Poland and France, only on a grander stage. If the Red Army had already lost so many divisions, how could it possibly defend Moscow? Yet this confidence masked deeper truths. The German High Command, particularly Army Group Center, was beginning to strain under the weight of its own success. The rapid drive east had stretched supply lines to the breaking point. Trains could not keep pace with the front. Soviet railways used a wider gauge, forcing conversion of tracks. Horse-drawn carts, relied upon heavily by the Wehrmacht, could not cover the vast distances of Russia. Fuel shortages grew acute. Panzer spearheads, which had been designed for quick, sharp campaigns, often found themselves idling while awaiting resupply. Ammunition, food, spare parts, all lagged far behind. For the ordinary soldier, rations grew meager, boots wore thin, and exhaustion began to gnaw at morale. Despite these warning signs, Hitler's confidence only deepened. To him, the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay, an empire held together by fear rather than loyalty. He believed that once Moscow fell, the entire Soviet system would collapse in on itself. His generals largely agreed. They saw the Soviet capital as the ultimate prize, its rail hubs essential for logistics, its factories crucial for war production, and its political weight impossible to overstate. In their view, a decisive blow at Moscow before winter would end the campaign entirely, sparing Germany from the nightmare of a prolonged war in the east. But confidence drifted into arrogance. German planners underestimated not only the sheer size of the Soviet Union, but also the resilience of its people and the depth of its reserves. Every encirclement that seemed final was followed by the appearance of new Soviet formations. Every destroyed division was replaced by another, hastily mobilized yet stubbornly determined. Intelligence reports warning of these reserves were dismissed. Instead, Hitler boasted to his inner circle that one final thrust toward Moscow would shatter the Soviet heart. The Wehrmacht, however, was not a limitless force. Already the drive east had exacted a heavy toll. Hundreds of tanks were out of action from mechanical failure or lack of parts. Casualties mounted daily, and replacements were slow to arrive. The terrain itself became an enemy. Dust-choked convoys in summer heat, while autumn threatened to bring the dreaded Rasputitsa, the sea of mud that would mire vehicles and men alike. Time was no ally of Germany, and yet Hitler pressed onward, believing that Moscow was within reach if only he demanded more from his exhausted armies. Thus, the stage was set for a campaign driven as much by hubris as by strategy. Hitler's belief that Moscow could be taken before the first snow fell would propel the Wehrmacht into one of the most brutal and decisive struggles of the entire war. It was a gamble of historic proportions, one that ignored the limits of logistics, the resilience of the Soviet people, and the coming wrath of the Russian winter. By August 1941, the Wehrmacht stood at a crossroads. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, had already driven deep into the Soviet heartland, its panzer spearheads threatening to break open the road to Moscow. The German generals, men like Halder, Guderian and Bock, pleaded with Hitler to seize the opportunity. They argued that one decisive thrust toward the Soviet capital would end the campaign before winter, but in the Reich Chancellery and at Hitler's forward headquarters, a different vision prevailed. The Führer, gazing at the vast map spread across his table, saw Moscow not as the immediate prize, but as a distraction from what he believed were the true jewels of the Soviet Empire: Ukraine's rich farmland, coal, and oil fields. To Hitler, war was not merely a contest of armies. It was a struggle for resources, for Lebensraum, for the economic foundations of empire. Ukraine, with its golden wheat fields and mineral wealth, represented a treasure trove that could fuel the German war machine for years to come. Moscow, by contrast, was dismissed as a symbolic target, a political hub whose capture he believed was less urgent than strangling the Soviet Union's capacity to wage war. He declared that we must cut the Soviet Union off from its breadbasket, and issued the fateful order. Army Group Center would halt its drive on Moscow, its armored divisions diverted south to encircle Soviet forces in Ukraine. The decision stunned his generals. Heinz Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Group, protested bitterly. His armoured divisions, already poised to push further east, were forced to wheel southward into terrain ill-suited for rapid manoeuvres. For days, Guderian argued with Hitler face to face, insisting that Moscow was the decisive target. But Hitler's mind was made up. In his view, once Ukraine was secured and Leningrad besieged in the north, Moscow would fall like a ripe fruit with no need for immediate sacrifice. Thus began one of the most consequential diversions of the entire war. The mighty panzers of Army Group Center roared southward toward Kiev, joining forces with Army Group South in a colossal encirclement. The operation was a tactical masterpiece. By September, German armour had closed the trap around the Ukrainian capital, capturing over 600,000 Soviet soldiers in what remains one of the largest encirclements in military history. Propaganda in Berlin celebrated the victory as proof of Hitler's genius, hailing the destruction of entire Soviet armies as a death blow to Stalin's regime. But the cost of this triumph was hidden in the calendar. Weeks had been lost, precious weeks in which the Wehrmacht might have marched on Moscow. The vast distances of Ukraine drained the strength of German logistics, already stretched to breaking. Tanks and trucks burned through dwindling supplies of fuel, horses collapsed in exhaustion, men marched until their boots fell apart, and when the panzers finally turned back north to rejoin Army Group Center, they returned battered, delayed, and no longer the sharp, fresh blades of June. For the Soviets, the diversion brought unexpected salvation. Though Stalin reeled from the catastrophic losses at Kiev, the pause in the German advance bought time to raise fresh armies, time to fortify Moscow, time to evacuate factories east of the Urals. Soviet engineers worked day and night, constructing defensive lines around the capital. Reinforcements from Siberia were mobilized. The Red Army, bloodied but not broken, was given a reprieve to recover. Hitler, however, could not see the trap he had laid for himself. Blinded by his obsession with Ukraine's resources, he believed the campaign was unfolding exactly as he envisioned. He saw the destruction at Kiev as vindication, proof that his intuition was superior to the cautious warnings of his generals. Yet the Wehrmacht's focus was no longer singular. Instead of a concentrated strike on Moscow, its strength had been divided, its momentum dissipated, its timetable fatally disrupted. By the time the German High Command turned its eyes once more toward Moscow, the summer sun was fading and the dreaded Russian autumn lay just ahead. The roads that might have borne tanks swiftly eastward would soon dissolve into rivers of mud. Winter, the eternal ally of Russia, was approaching, and the decision to turn south, to split the Wehrmacht's focus at the moment of its greatest opportunity, would stand as one of Hitler's most ruinous choices. As the smoke of Kiev's destruction still lingered, the Soviet Union faced a moment of apparent ruin. Millions of men had been lost since June. Thousands of tanks and guns lay wrecked across the steppe, and whole armies had been swallowed in encirclement. By all traditional measures of warfare, the Soviet Union should have collapsed under the weight of the German onslaught. Yet, in the ashes of defeat, Stalin's war machine began a remarkable transformation, one that would defy military logic and alter the balance of the entire war. At the heart of this transformation was the Soviet state's ruthless ability to mobilize. Stalin, once paralyzed in the opening days of the invasion, now reasserted his iron grip. He stood before the Soviet people with the grim declaration, "Comrades, our cause is just. The enemy will be defeated. Victory will be ours." But victory, he knew, required more than slogans. It required men, weapons, and an industrial miracle. First came the reserves. The Red Army's losses were catastrophic, yet Stalin ordered fresh conscriptions on a scale that dwarfed anything in Europe. From the villages of Siberia to the factories of the Urals, men were torn from their homes and sent to the front. Entire classes of teenagers and older men beyond typical fighting age were called to serve. Training was often rushed, weapons scarce, but the Soviet command focused on quantity, knowing that manpower was their one inexhaustible resource. Then came the industrial exodus. With the Wehrmacht advancing deep into European Russia, much of the Soviet Union's industrial heartland lay under direct threat. Cities like Kharkov, Kiev, and Smolensk were already lost. Factories in Leningrad and Moscow teetered on the edge of capture. Stalin and his State Defense Committee, the GKO, made a decision unprecedented in scale. Dismantle Soviet industry, bolt by bolt, and move it eastward, beyond the reach of German armies. The Great Evacuation began in the summer and autumn of 1941. Entire factories were loaded onto trains, lathes, presses, turbines, even half-assembled tanks, hauled thousands of kilometers across the Ural Mountains to cities like Sverdlovsk, Chelyabinsk, and Magnitogorsk. Workers, often women and children, accompanied the machinery, laboring in makeshift conditions to reassemble production lines. Many lived in tents or dugouts beside the plants, braving cold and hunger while machines were bolted to the ground in bare sheds. By the winter, despite unimaginable hardship, these relocated factories roared back to life, producing rifles, shells, and the legendary T-34 tanks that would soon roll back toward the front. Meanwhile, Moscow itself became a fortress. Defensive belts were carved into the earth, anti-tank ditches dug by the hands of hundreds of thousands of civilians, students, laborers, and even schoolchildren. Barricades rose in the streets, while the Kremlin was camouflaged to appear from the air as an ordinary residential block. Stalin ordered that the city would not be surrendered, and to underscore his resolve, he remained in Moscow even as German panzers closed in, a gesture that stiffened morale and symbolized unbreakable defiance. The Soviet recovery was not only material, but psychological. At first, panic had swept the population, mass evacuations, rumors of surrender, despair in the ranks. But the vast propaganda machine of the state stoked flames of resistance. Newspapers printed stories of partisan heroes striking German columns from behind. Radio broadcasts carried the voice of Levitan, whose baritone announcements turned every battlefield victory, however small, into a rallying cry. Above all, Stalin fostered the idea of the Great Patriotic War, a struggle not for ideology, but for the survival of the motherland itself. By October 1941, as Hitler's Panzer divisions prepared for the decisive assault on Moscow, Operation Typhoon, the Red Army was battered but no longer broken. New armies were forming in the east, drawn from reserves and reinforced by industrial output just beginning to flow from the relocated factories. The Siberian divisions, hardened by winters harsher than any German could imagine, were being readied for transfer westward, aided by intelligence that Japan would not strike the Soviet Far East. The Soviet Union had suffered blows that would have shattered any other nation. But in the crucible of destruction, it had found resilience. Stalin's regime, ruthless and unyielding, had harnessed the vastness of Russia itself, its people, its land, its sheer depth, to absorb the German storm. The Wehrmacht believed it was closing in on victory, yet beneath the surface a tide of recovery was rising, preparing to meet the invaders at the very gates of Moscow. The Wehrmacht's iron tide, once so swift and relentless, met a foe it had not accounted for, an enemy that could not be bombed, outflanked, or defeated in battle. It was the Russian earth itself. The Germans had swept through the vast plains of the Soviet Union on a wave of confidence, their blitzkrieg promising a swift collapse of Stalin's empire. But as September gave way to October, the seasons shifted. Dark clouds gathered over the steppe. Rain began to fall, not a light drizzle, but sheets upon sheets, turning roads into rivers and fields into swamps. The Germans had entered the infamous Rasputitsa, the season of mud. The Rasputitsa was a phenomenon both ancient and feared in Russia's military history. For centuries, invaders had cursed it. Mongol horsemen, Napoleon's Grande Armée, and now Hitler's Wehrmacht. The well-packed earth roads that had carried panzers like steel arrows now dissolved into morasses of sucking, clinging mud. Trucks sank to their axles, horses collapsed under their burdens, and men trudged waist-deep through muck, their boots pulled off by the suction of the earth. The Wehrmacht had been built for speed, for decisive maneuvers that depended on precision timing and movement. The Rasputitsa turned the offensive into a crawl. Entire columns came to a standstill. Tanks that once roared ahead with mechanical ferocity now churned helplessly, their treads clogged with clay. Supply convoys, stretched already to the limit, became snarled on impassable roads. Fuel trucks arrived days late, if they arrived at all. Ammunition carts overturned, horses, still the backbone of the German logistics system, collapsed by the thousands, their bodies littering the roadsides, a grim testament to the failing advance. Exhaustion compounded the misery. Soldiers who had marched triumphantly through the summer now found themselves drenched to the bone, caked in mud, their uniforms soaked and rotting on their backs. They had been promised a swift war, over by autumn. Instead, they slogged through unending storms, hungry, shivering, and diseased. Dysentery spread through the ranks, lice-infested clothing. The legendary efficiency of the German army began to crack under the weight of elemental hardship. The Soviets, though battered and bleeding, found salvation in the mud. For every day that the German columns stalled, Stalin's factories in the east turned out new weapons, new planes, and new tanks. Fresh recruits streamed from the Urals and Siberia, pouring into Moscow's defenses. Rasputitsa bought them precious time. German generals cursed the rain, but Hitler remained convinced that victory was only weeks away. He urged his commanders onward, demanding movement toward Moscow. Yet even as they struggled forward, every step was paid in blood, sweat, and gasoline drained from trucks stuck in the mire. For the first time since June, the Wehrmacht was no longer unstoppable. It was slowed, humbled, and for the first time, uncertain. By late October, the offensive was still moving, but its pace had slowed to a crawl. The Rasputitsa had transformed the battlefield into an endless swamp, stalling mechanized warfare and grinding down men's spirits. The road to Moscow was still open, but the Wehrmacht's strength was already bleeding into the mud. The Germans believed their greatest enemy was the Red Army, but here, in the rain-soaked plains of Russia, they discovered a far older adversary, one that no weapon could destroy. The land itself. By October 1941, despite exhaustion, mud, and mounting losses, the Wehrmacht still stood at the gates of history. Operation Typhoon, the final assault on Moscow, was unleashed with all the weight Germany could muster. Hitler was convinced the capital of the Soviet Union would soon fall, that one decisive blow would bring Stalin's regime crashing down. For the soldiers in the field, weary and mud-stained, the order to advance once more carried a new sense of urgency, a belief that victory was at last within reach. The offensive began on October 2nd, 1941, under skies that briefly cleared. Before the rains returned, German High Command hoped to deliver the knockout strike. Army Group Center, already bled from months of combat, was reinforced with fresh divisions, panzers refitted, and Luftwaffe squadrons prepared to provide overwhelming support. The objective was clear: encircle and annihilate Soviet forces guarding the approaches to Moscow. At first, the results seemed spectacular. German armoured spearheads tore open Soviet lines near Vyazma and Bryansk, advancing with a speed not seen since the early summer. Entire Red Army formations were encircled in vast pockets, their positions collapsing under the relentless German assault. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured, their columns of prisoners stretching endlessly across the horizon. To the German High Command, these victories confirmed everything they had believed about their superiority. Officers sent glowing reports to Berlin. Propaganda trumpeted the collapse of Soviet resistance, presenting images of endless Soviet prisoners as proof that Moscow itself would soon be theirs. Soldiers who only weeks before had cursed the mud now felt the surge of triumph once again. It seemed as if the Wehrmacht's fortunes had been reborn. In the villages and forests west of Moscow, German morale rose sharply. Troops joked that they would soon be parading in Red Square, that the war would be over before the first snow fell. The psychological weight of Moscow, heart of Soviet power, symbol of Russian endurance, was not lost on them. To take the capital was to strike at the very soul of their enemy. Yet beneath this surface of optimism, cracks remained. The German advance depended on fuel and ammunition delivered across shattered roads, and every mile forward stretched their supply lines thinner. Many of the tanks rolling eastward carried patched armour and worn engines. Infantrymen marched on blistered feet, their rations short, their uniforms inadequate for the coming cold. Even in victory, the Wehrmacht was burning itself out. For the Soviets, October was a nightmare of retreat and loss. Entire armies vanished in the German encirclements, yet Stalin refused to abandon Moscow. He issued orders of brutal clarity: not one step back. Deserters were shot. Civilians were conscripted to dig trenches and lay defences around the capital. Reinforcements from Siberia, hardened by the bitter winters of the east, were already moving westward by train. But in early October, this was still invisible to the Germans. To them, the Red Army appeared broken, disorganized, incapable of recovery. For Hitler and his generals, Operation Typhoon seemed destined to be the final decisive chapter of the campaign. Moscow appeared to be theirs for the taking, and as the Wehrmacht surged forward through smoke, mud, and flame, they believed the end of the war in the east was at last within reach. In early October 1941, as Operation Typhoon surged forward, two immense battles unfolded west of Moscow. To the Germans, they seemed like victories beyond imagination, vast encirclements that swallowed entire Soviet armies. Yet hidden within these triumphs lay the seeds of disaster, for the Red Army's sacrifice at Vyazma and Bryansk would delay the German advance at the very moment speed was most crucial. The plan of the German High Command was brutally efficient. Armoured spearheads from north and south would converge around the Soviet lines, trapping Stalin's forces in colossal pockets. The manoeuvre was executed with devastating precision. By October 7th, near Vyazma, west of Moscow, 4 entire Soviet armies, nearly 600,000 men, were encircled. To the south, near Bryansk, another 3 armies, roughly 35,000 soldiers, were cut off. In a matter of days, the Red Army suffered losses so staggering that even the Wehrmacht itself was astonished. The German propaganda machine moved quickly. Films and photographs showed endless columns of Soviet prisoners shuffling through the mud, their faces hollow with exhaustion, their weapons discarded in heaps along the roads. Estimates claimed that over 65,000 soldiers had been taken captive in just these 2 battles, making them some of the largest encirclements in military history. To the German public and to the soldiers at the front, it appeared that Stalin's army had been shattered beyond repair. At first glance, these victories seemed to confirm Hitler's vision of inevitable conquest. Moscow lay open and the Red Army seemed mortally wounded. Yet reality was far more complex. For while the Wehrmacht had indeed captured and destroyed staggering numbers of Soviet troops, the fighting inside the pockets was savage, prolonged, and costly. The Soviet soldiers did not collapse quickly. They fought to the last bullet, to the last man, delaying the German advance in ways that Berlin had not anticipated. Inside the encirclements, Soviet units resisted with ferocious determination. Cut off from supplies with no hope of reinforcement, they turned forests and villages into fortresses, ambushing German patrols, slowing armoured advances, forcing the Wehrmacht to commit time and precious resources to annihilate them. Soviet commanders ordered desperate breakouts. Small groups of soldiers, often without food or ammunition, hacked their way east through swamps, forests, and German lines, some reaching Moscow weeks later to rejoin the fight. These pockets became killing grounds, but they also became shields. Every day the trapped Soviet armies held out was another day the German timetable slipped, another day the Soviet capital gained in preparation. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the scale of the disaster was concealed from the population. Official communiques acknowledged retreats, but never the magnitude of the losses. Still, whispers spread, and Stalin's government braced for panic. Behind the scenes, however, the Soviet leadership moved with grim determination. Reserves from the east were hastened toward Moscow. Factories continued to uproot and reassemble beyond the Urals, and Stalin himself, though shaken, refused to flee the capital. For the German commanders, the victories at Vyazma and Bryansk seemed absolute, yet they brought with them an unforeseen cost. The Wehrmacht had consumed precious fuel and ammunition in annihilating armies that, in a sense, had already been sacrificed by Stalin. The calendar now marched relentlessly forward. October days bled away into weeks. The window for reaching Moscow before the winter closed grew narrower with each hour lost in the killing fields west of the city. The Vyazma and Bryansk encirclements were victories, but hollow ones. The Soviet armies trapped in the pockets had given their lives to buy time, and that time would prove invaluable. The Wehrmacht had achieved destruction on an unprecedented scale, yet in doing so, they had also ensured that their great drive toward Moscow was slowed, their strength diminished, and their momentum fatally blunted. As the smoke cleared over the killing grounds, both sides drew very different lessons. The Germans believed the road to Moscow was now theirs. The Soviets knew that though they had been struck with unimaginable loss, the capital still stood, and the invaders' advance was already faltering. By mid-October 1941, the thunder of war reached the very gates of Moscow. News of the Soviet defeats at Vyazma and Bryansk spread like wildfire, and for the first time the Soviet capital trembled on the edge of collapse. Panic, fear, and uncertainty gripped the city, and for a fleeting moment the fate of Moscow and perhaps the Soviet Union itself hung in the balance. The encirclements to the west had cost Stalin's armies hundreds of thousands of men. German tanks, though slowed, now surged closer to the capital, and rumors of their arrival swirled through the streets. In Moscow, the atmosphere shifted from grim determination to raw fear. Whispers of betrayal and collapse spread. Was the Red Army truly finished? Would the Germans march into the city within days? The government attempted to maintain calm, but the people could see the truth in small details: the blackout curtains drawn over every window, the growing number of trenches dug across Moscow's outskirts, and the sudden evacuation of ministries, archives, and whole factories to the east. Trains packed with machinery, workers and their families clattered toward the Urals, leaving behind a city that felt hollowed and vulnerable. On October the 15th, the panic broke into the open. That morning, the State Defense Committee issued a partial evacuation order. Essential industries and government offices were to be relocated east of the Volga. Rumors quickly warped into something far more terrifying: that the entire government was abandoning Moscow. Crowds surged through train stations, desperate to board evacuation trains. Roads out of the city became clogged with carts, cars, and families carrying whatever belongings they could. For ordinary Muscovites, it felt as if the world was collapsing. Shops were looted, banks were overrun by citizens demanding to withdraw their savings. Desperate voices filled the streets, pleading for tickets, fighting for places on trains, clutching children, and dragging suitcases. The city that had once embodied Soviet power now seemed on the verge of chaos. In those same hours, many within Stalin's circle urged him to leave. They argued that the capital was indefensible, that the government must survive to continue the fight from further east, perhaps even from Kuibyshev on the Volga. The logical choice, the safe choice, was to evacuate. But Stalin hesitated. He understood something deeper. Abandoning Moscow meant more than losing a city. It meant conceding the heart of the Soviet state, surrendering the spiritual center of the revolution, and perhaps shattering the morale of the nation beyond repair. On October 16th, as the exodus continued, Stalin made his choice. He would stay. At Moscow's Komsomolskaya Square, thousands gathered as word spread that the leader had not fled. Stalin appeared in public, calm and composed, his presence itself a weapon against despair. The message was unmistakable. The capital would not be abandoned, and the Soviet leadership would share its fate with the people. This decision, simple yet profound, rippled through the city. The same Muscovites who had earlier fought for places on trains now returned to their homes. The panic subsided into grim determination. If Stalin remained, so too would they. Moscow would be defended. Work resumed with frantic urgency. Civilians, students, and soldiers alike dug anti-tank ditches and trenches around the capital. Women carried bricks and sandbags to build barricades. Militia units were raised. Workers from factories, clerks from offices, even teenagers handed rifles and ordered to stand beside regular troops. Moscow became a fortress. Its people transformed into soldiers of last resort. Behind the walls of the Kremlin, Stalin reinforced his message of defiance. Orders were issued. The city was to be held at all costs. Discipline tightened, dissent crushed. The Soviet capital was no longer a mere city. It had become the symbol of Soviet survival. In those dark days of October 1941, Moscow came perilously close to collapse. Fear had swept its streets, panic had torn through its stations, and for a moment it seemed the heart of the Soviet Union might cease to beat. Yet Stalin's decision to remain, his refusal to flee, changed the course of events. The panic broke, the people steadied, and Moscow braced itself for the storm to come. With the German army pressing ever closer to the Soviet capital, Moscow itself became a battlefield long before the first shots were fired at its gates. In the autumn of 1941, the city's survival no longer depended solely on the Red Army. It became the responsibility of every citizen, every worker, every student, and every family that called Moscow home. What unfolded was not just the defense of a city, but the birth of a true people's war. The call went out in October. The capital must be fortified. Defensive lines were to be carved out of the very earth, transforming fields, forests, and city blocks into layers of obstacles designed to slow, if not stop, the German advance. But the Red Army, battered and reeling, could not do it alone. The task fell to the civilians. Almost overnight, Moscow was transformed into a colossal construction site. Men and women, young and old, streamed out of factories, schools, and offices with shovels, picks, and their bare hands. University students labored beside factory workers. Elderly pensioners worked alongside school children. It did not matter if one had never held a spade before, everyone was expected to dig. By day and by night, tens of thousands worked in bitter cold, their hands blistered, their backs aching, yet their determination unbroken. The sound of hammers striking nails, of saws cutting wood, of shovels biting into frozen ground, echoed across the city and its outskirts. Moscow was being wrapped in rings of earth and steel. Anti-tank ditches, some stretching for miles, were carved into the soil, deep trenches designed to swallow German panzers whole. Fortifications rose out of the ground, earthen ramparts, bunkers reinforced with timber, and camouflaged firing positions. Anti-tank obstacles, jagged steel hedgehogs, and massive concrete blocks were dragged into position by teams of civilians, often without machinery, only ropes and raw strength. Roads leading into the capital were mined, barricaded, and rigged for demolition. The labor was relentless. Food was scarce, warmth even scarcer, yet the work never ceased. Women carried logs on their shoulders, their faces smeared with dirt. Boys no older than 14 hauled buckets of sand. Elderly men, their hands trembling from age, stubbornly swung picks into the frozen earth. For them, each shovelful of soil was an act of defiance, each obstacle a promise that the Germans would pay dearly for every step. In those days, the front line did not lie only at the edge of Moscow. It ran through every street, every factory, every trench dug by civilian hands. The city itself became a fortress, and its people the soldiers of last resort. By November, Moscow's defences had taken shape. The capital was encircled by three main defensive belts, lines of ditches, obstacles and strongpoints stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Within the city, key squares and avenues were barricaded. Even the Kremlin itself was camouflaged, its red brick walls painted over, its golden domes covered in dark paint so that from the air it blended into the cityscape. Yet the most powerful weapon forged in those weeks was not made of steel or concrete. It was the spirit of the people. What had begun as panic and despair was transformed into unity and resistance. Moscow was no longer merely a city under threat. It had become a fortress of willpower. Every trench, every barricade, every steel obstacle was more than a barrier against tanks. It was a statement: the people of Moscow would not surrender. As the first snows of November dusted the earthworks and fortifications, the German army continued its relentless push. But now they faced not only the Red Army, they faced an entire population, a city that had chosen to fight with shovels, picks, and courage as their weapons. This was the essence of the People's War, a struggle not just of armies but of nations. In Moscow, civilians had transformed fear into fortitude, despair into determination, and as the storm of battle drew ever nearer, their work would prove to be the bedrock upon which the city's survival was built. By the autumn of 1941, the Soviet Union stood on the edge of disaster. The Wehrmacht's advance had been devastating, armies destroyed, cities lost, millions of Soviet soldiers taken prisoner. At the gates of Moscow, panic threatened to unravel what little remained of order. In this moment of peril, a single man was summoned to take command. His name would soon become synonymous with survival, resilience, and eventual victory: General Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. Zhukov was no stranger to crisis. Hardened by years of service, he had risen from humble origins as the son of a peasant to one of the Red Army's most capable commanders. He had already proven himself in battle, at Khalkhin Gol in Mongolia in 1939, where his mastery of encirclement crushed the Japanese, and again in the desperate days of 1941 when he was rushed from one collapsing front to another, patching holes, reorganizing shattered units, and imposing iron discipline. Now, with Moscow itself at stake, Stalin had no choice but to entrust him with the defense of the capital. When Zhukov arrived, what he found was chaos. Soldiers retreated without orders. Supply lines faltered. Morale sagged under the weight of unrelenting German pressure. Moscow seemed ready to crumble. But Zhukov was not a man who tolerated weakness. He imposed discipline with ruthless determination. Orders were to be followed without question. Defeatism was crushed. Retreat forbidden unless explicitly commanded. Those who faltered faced severe consequences. In the shadow of Moscow's survival, mercy had no place. His leadership was not gentle, but it was effective. Units that had been disorganized were reformed. Stragglers were driven back to the front. Fortifications begun by civilians were reinforced under military precision. Where others saw collapse, Zhukov saw opportunity to harness what remained of Soviet strength and to wield it with decisive purpose. But discipline alone would not save Moscow. Strategy was needed, brilliance that could offset German superiority in training, weaponry, and momentum. This was where Zhukov excelled. He studied the battlefield like a chessboard, anticipating the enemy's moves, seeking their weaknesses, and preparing the counterblows that could turn desperation into survival. He understood that Moscow could not be held by brute force alone. The Wehrmacht had to be slowed, stretched, and bled until their momentum broke. Zhukov ordered counterattacks where the enemy least expected them, striking not to annihilate but to disrupt, to unbalance, to buy time. Every day Moscow stood was a victory, every hour another step toward salvation. His brilliance lay in his ability to use everything at hand. Fresh reinforcements drawn from Siberia, battle-hardened troops accustomed to the brutal cold, were deployed with surgical precision. Artillery batteries were massed at critical points, delivering devastating barrages that shattered German advances. Even the weather, as winter crept in, was turned into an ally. Zhukov knew how to fight in conditions the Germans had not prepared for. Above all, Zhukov inspired his soldiers. He was not a distant commander hidden in safety. He often appeared at the front, his imposing figure and piercing gaze reminding men that their fight was not hopeless. Soldiers spoke of his presence as a force of will, a man who could demand the impossible and somehow make it happen. In Zhukov, the Soviet Union found not merely a general, but a commander who embodied its defiance. He was harsh, often feared, sometimes even hated, but never doubted. Under his leadership, the defense of Moscow transformed from desperate resistance into a calculated stand. By late November, the German advance, once unstoppable, had begun to falter. The Wehrmacht still pressed forward, but every mile now cost them dearly. Behind the front lines, Moscow still lived, still breathed, still resisted, and the man who had made that possible was Zhukov. History would remember him as one of the greatest commanders of the Second World War, but in the winter of 1941, his reputation was forged not in glory, but in grit, in steel, in the ruthless discipline and strategic brilliance that saved Moscow from collapse. Where others might have yielded, Zhukov endured. Where others might have broken, he fought back. And in doing so, he ensured that the capital of the Soviet Union would stand against the storm. By late November 1941, the storm had arrived at the very gates of Moscow. The Wehrmacht, battle-hardened from its conquests across Europe, now stood within striking distance of the Soviet capital. Villages burned, roads collapsed under the iron weight of German panzers, and artillery thunder echoed across the plains. The greatest city of the Soviet Union, the heart of its people and the symbol of its survival, now trembled as the enemy approached. The German advance had been a triumph of speed and brutality. Army Group Center under Field Marshal Fyodor von Bock had torn through Belarus and Western Russia, crushing resistance, seizing territory at a pace unseen in modern war. By autumn, Smolensk, Vyazma, Bryansk, cities once thought to be Soviet strongholds, had fallen. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were killed or captured in vast encirclements. The road to Moscow, though costly, lay open. The Wehrmacht pushed relentlessly eastward, convinced that victory was within reach. German high command believed that a final thrust would bring the Soviet Union to its knees. After all, how could Moscow withstand the momentum of an army that had not been stopped since the invasion of France? Now, the spires of Moscow were within range. German reconnaissance patrols reported seeing the faint glow of the Kremlin's red stars in the distance. Columns of refugees choked the roads, families carrying what little they could salvage, their eyes hollow from exhaustion and fear. To them, Moscow no longer seemed an unshakable fortress, but a city on the edge of collapse. Inside the capital, the atmosphere was suffocating. Air raid sirens wailed daily as German bombers roared overhead, dropping their deadly cargo on factories, rail stations, and homes. Fires smouldered, smoke mixed with the bitter November cold, and yet the city endured. Civilians dug trenches, built barricades, and prepared for street fighting. The Soviet leadership, though shaken, remained defiant. Stalin himself refused to abandon Moscow, declaring that his place was in the city, no matter the risk. For the German soldiers, the vision of Moscow so close was intoxicating. The myth of inevitable victory, the idea that the Wehrmacht was unstoppable, burned within their ranks. They could almost taste the triumph, the glory of parading through Red Square. But for all their confidence, they did not realize how close they were to the breaking point. The advance had not come without cost. Each mile toward Moscow was paid for in blood, fuel, and time. Roads turned into rivers of mud under the autumn rains of the Rasputitsa. Supply lines stretched thin, men exhausted, and winter winds began to bite with a cruel sharpness that the Germans were unprepared to face. Still, they pressed forward, unaware that their greatest obstacle was not just Soviet resistance, but the land and climate itself. On the Soviet side, the situation was desperate. General Zhukov had imposed order, but the Red Army was still vastly outnumbered and reeling from previous defeats. Reserves were scarce, weapons in short supply, and the line defending Moscow dangerously thin. Soldiers dug frozen earth with bare hands, preparing to meet the German tide with whatever strength they had left. The fate of the nation truly hung by a thread. The world watched as Moscow stood on the brink of annihilation. For the Germans, victory seemed inevitable, within their grasp. For the Soviets, defeat seemed only a heartbeat away. The capital of the Soviet Union, a city of more than 4 million souls, faced its darkest hour. And yet, history would not allow Moscow to fall so easily. Beyond the horizon, forces were gathering, men hardened by Siberia's endless snows, weapons newly forged, and strategies that would exploit the very overreach of the German advance. The Wehrmacht had reached the outskirts, but the battle for Moscow was only beginning. The fate of the Eastern Front, perhaps even the fate of the Second World War itself, now rested on what would unfold in the icy fields outside Moscow. In those frozen days of late 1941, the world held its breath. As the Wehrmacht pressed against the gates of Moscow, convinced victory was within its grasp, the Soviet Union prepared a response that would shatter the illusion of German invincibility. From the vast frozen reaches of Siberia, across thousands of kilometers of wilderness, came soldiers unlike any the Nazis had faced before, men hardened by the most unforgiving climate on Earth. Warriors trained for the cold, equipped for the blizzards, and prepared to fight in temperatures that would freeze steel and bone. For months, Stalin had resisted calls to strip forces from the east. Japan loomed as a constant threat, its armies poised in Manchuria. But then came a turning point. Intelligence, secured through the brilliance of Soviet spy Richard Sorge, revealed that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union. Instead, Tokyo's eyes were fixed on the Pacific and its coming clash with the United States. With that knowledge, Stalin made a decision of historic consequence. He ordered entire divisions from Siberia and the Far East to be sent west to defend Moscow at all costs. These were not ordinary troops. These were veterans of the taiga and the steppe, men who could march for days through snow, who wore padded white camouflage instead of thin summer uniforms, who knew how to survive when temperatures plunged below -30. Their rifles never froze, their spirits never cracked. To the half-frozen Wehrmacht, still clad in autumn uniforms, they would seem like ghosts of the winter itself, relentless and unyielding. As trains thundered across the expanse of Russia, packed with Siberian divisions, Moscow's defenses transformed. The fresh troops poured into the capital, their very presence electrifying the weary defenders. Red Army morale, once crumbling under the shadow of encirclement and defeat, now surged with new strength. Civilians who had been digging trenches in desperation now cheered as columns of these reinforcements marched through the snowy streets. General Georgy Zhukov, now in supreme command, recognized that the moment had come. He studied the exhausted, overstretched German lines and knew the invaders were vulnerable. Supply routes were breaking under the strain, divisions were bleeding men faster than they could be replaced, and frostbite was spreading through the Wehrmacht's ranks like wildfire. Where the Germans saw Moscow as a prize to be seized, Zhukov saw an opportunity to strike. The Soviet counteroffensive plan was bold, almost audacious. Rather than merely defend, Zhukov prepared to attack. Using the newly arrived Siberian divisions as the spearhead, he intended to smash into the German flanks north and south of Moscow, encircle their forward elements, and push them back from the capital. It was a gamble, but one that drew upon the very weakness of the German army, a weakness hidden beneath its outward appearance of unstoppable momentum. Every detail was considered. Ski battalions were prepared to glide across frozen fields. Cavalry units, long dismissed by German generals as obsolete, would strike where tanks bogged down in the snow. Artillery was dug into concealed positions, ready to unleash devastating volleys once the order was given. And at the heart of it all, the Siberian infantry, faces wrapped in scarves, bayonets fixed, waited for the command to advance. The German soldiers at the outskirts of Moscow did not yet know it, but the tide of war was beginning to turn. In the dead of winter, in conditions for which they were utterly unprepared, they would soon face an enemy reborn, an army that no longer clung to survival, but one that carried the fire of vengeance in its heart. On December 5, 1941, the storm broke. With the crack of artillery, the blare of bugles, and the roar of charging infantry, the Soviet counteroffensive erupted across the frozen front. The Wehrmacht had reached the doorstep of Moscow. Now, the Red Army was about to drive them back, and in that reversal lay not only the salvation of the Soviet capital, but the first great fracture in Hitler's dream of conquest. At first it was just a dusting, a fine layer of white powder settling over the Russian fields, quieting the land and masking the scars of battle. But then, as the days shortened and the sun sank lower in the sky, the snows thickened, falling in sheets that blanketed the roads, the forests, the trenches, and the ruins of villages already torn apart by war. Winter had come to Russia, and with it, the doom of the German advance. For the Wehrmacht, the cold arrived like an invisible enemy, one they were neither prepared for nor trained to fight. When Operation Barbarossa was launched in June, Hitler had promised his generals that the Soviet Union would collapse in mere weeks. No one in Berlin had imagined a campaign stretching into the Russian winter, and so hundreds of thousands of German soldiers marched deeper into the east, clad only in thin grey uniforms meant for summer and autumn, with boots that cracked in the frost and coats that were woefully inadequate against the plunging temperatures. What had once been the proud, unstoppable columns of the Wehrmacht were now men shivering in frozen foxholes, their breath crystallizing in the night air, their hands too numb to grip their rifles. Machine gun bolts froze solid, lubricants turned to glue. Engines that had carried tanks across Europe seized and died in the bitter cold. Horses, once the backbone of the German supply chain, collapsed by the thousands in the snow, their bodies left to stiffen on the roadside. The first snowfalls did more than freeze flesh and steel. They ground the German advance into a slow, desperate crawl. Roads became treacherous rivers of ice, rutted and clogged with vehicles abandoned in ditches. Supply trucks could not reach the front, food rations spoiled or never arrived, ammunition stocks dwindled. Soldiers scavenged whatever they could, women's shawls, Russian peasant coats, even curtains ripped from village homes, to wrap around themselves in a vain attempt to hold back the cold. The contrast with the Soviet defenders was striking. The Red Army, seasoned by generations of harsh winters, was clothed in padded coats, felt boots and fur hats. Their rifles functioned in the snow, their skis cut across drifts that trapped German infantry waist-deep. To the Soviets, the first snowfall was not a curse, but an ally, a familiar weapon they knew how to wield. To the Germans, it was a merciless adversary that stole their strength and froze the will of even the bravest soldiers. Medical reports from the front tell a grim story. Entire units crippled not by bullets or shells, but by frostbite. Fingers blackened and fell away. Toes rotted in boots that had turned into blocks of ice. Men lost their ears, their noses, their faces to the wind that cut like knives across the steppe. In some units, frostbite claimed more victims than Soviet fire. The first snows were not just weather, they were the harbinger of a deeper truth. The German war machine, so invincible in the warmth of summer, was being undone by the Russian winter itself. The very climate had become a weapon, a silent army marching alongside the Red Army, striking without pity, sparing no one. And yet still the Wehrmacht clung to their positions, still they tried to push forward, driven by Hitler's orders that forbade retreat. Their frozen footprints marked the edge of their ambition, but the iron grip of the cold had begun to hold them fast. As snow fell heavier with each passing day, the dream of capturing Moscow slipped further from German grasp. What began as the first delicate flakes had become a storm, one that would bury the hopes of an empire under drifts of ice and snow. For weeks, the Wehrmacht had clawed at the frozen earth outside Moscow, convinced that victory was still within reach, convinced that one more push would bring the Soviet capital to its knees. But the first snows had stolen their momentum. The frost had crippled their machines, hunger gnawed at their bellies, and despair seeped into their hearts. They did not know it yet, but the tide was about to turn. December the 5th, 1941, would mark the moment when the hunters became the hunted. In the forests north and west of Moscow, hidden by the thick pines and buried beneath camouflage nets, fresh Soviet divisions waited. They were not weary conscripts dragged from the cities, nor shattered remnants of summer battles. These were the men of Siberia, hardened soldiers recalled from the Far East after Soviet intelligence confirmed that Japan would not strike from Manchuria. Clad in white camouflage, trained to move, fight and survive in sub-zero conditions, they were the very embodiment of winter war. When the order finally came, it was not cautious, it was not tentative, it was explosive. At dawn on December the 5th, the Red Army unleashed a massive counteroffensive along a 1,000-kilometer front. From Kalinin in the north to Kaluga in the south, artillery roared, shells split the sky, and then wave upon wave of Soviet infantry surged forward across the snow. The Germans, already frozen and exhausted, were stunned. They had believed the Red Army was broken, that the Soviets had nothing left to give. But suddenly, the fields that had been silent and still erupted with fire and movement. Soviet ski troops cut through drifts like swift shadows, machine guns blazing, cavalry units wrapped in greatcoats and armed with sabres thundered across the frozen plains. Tanks, T-34s built to endure the cold, lurched out of the forests and tore into the German lines. The Wehrmacht reeled. Whole regiments collapsed under the weight of the assault. Commanders who had once marched with arrogance now struggled to hold together shattered battalions. German soldiers who had spent days huddled against the cold were forced to abandon their trenches and run, their retreat leaving a trail of discarded rifles, frozen corpses, and burning vehicles. For the first time in the war, the German advance was not simply halted, it was driven backward. Towns that had been taken at terrible cost by the Wehrmacht were now abandoned in panic, recaptured by Soviet troops who raised the red banner once more. Villages that had been turned into German strongpoints became battlefields of bloody street fighting as Soviet infantry stormed through with bayonets fixed and grenades in hand. It was not just a counterattack, it was a revelation. The myth of German invincibility, carefully cultivated since 1939, shattered in the snow outside Moscow. Soldiers who had believed themselves masters of Europe now found themselves staggering in retreat, hounded by an enemy they had dismissed as weak, ill-prepared, and finished. Hitler's orders were clear. Hold the line at all costs, retreat was forbidden. But the Red Army's fury could not be denied. German positions buckled, commanders ignored the Führer's decrees, and units fell back in disorder. The great gamble of Barbarossa, the vision of seizing Moscow before the winter, had collapsed. On December 5, 1941, the world witnessed a new reality. The Soviet Union, bloodied but unbroken, had struck back with ferocity, and in that frozen counteroffensive lay the seeds of a larger truth, that the war in the East would not be short, it would not be easy, and it would not end with a German victory. Instead, it would become a struggle of endurance, a crucible of fire and ice where only the strongest would survive. The Red Army was no longer on the defensive. The initiative had changed hands. The road to Moscow was closed, and for the first time, the Wehrmacht knew fear. The first blows of the Soviet counterattack cracked the German front wide open. What began as shock on December 5th quickly transformed into collapse. All along the frozen line outside Moscow, villages that had endured months of occupation now became battlegrounds as the Red Army surged forward. The Wehrmacht, stunned and exhausted, staggered under the relentless pressure. For the first time since the war began, German soldiers were not advancing into enemy territory, they were being driven out. The Soviet push was not a single strike, but a relentless, rolling wave. Entire divisions advanced in coordinated thrusts, reclaiming mile after mile of snow-covered ground. Villages once burned and blackened by the German invasion now erupted with the sounds of liberation, the thundering approach of Soviet tanks, the crack of rifle fire, the crash of grenades tossed into German-held barns and cottages. Civilians who had spent the autumn hiding in cellars emerged to see the Wehrmacht retreating, their carefully built defences shattered. German soldiers, already worn thin by frostbite, hunger and exhaustion, found themselves fighting desperate rearguard actions. Their thin lines, stretched across vast distances, could not withstand the weight of fresh Soviet divisions pressing from every side. Machine gun nests fell silent as their crews were overrun. Artillery batteries abandoned their frozen guns, fleeing into the woods. Horses collapsed in the snow, their frozen bodies marking the paths of retreat. The Soviet offensive was fueled not only by numbers, but by determination. Ski battalions carved swift paths across the ice, bypassing German strongpoints and cutting off retreating units. Cavalry charges, thought to be relics of a bygone era, suddenly roared to life on the frozen plains, sabres flashing as German infantry scattered in panic. T-34 tanks, their broad tracks made for winter terrain, ploughed through drifts that immobilized German panzers, surrounding entire pockets of the enemy. Village after village was retaken. Names that had once been etched on German maps of conquest were now struck through and reclaimed in blood. Kalinin, Klin, Solnechnogorsk, places that had seemed stepping stones to Moscow, now became symbols of retreat, markers of German defeat. Soviet troops raised the red banner over burned-out town squares, their breath steaming in the frozen air, their cheers carrying across the snow. The psychological impact was enormous. German soldiers who had once boasted that they would celebrate Christmas in Moscow now muttered only about survival. The Wehrmacht's aura of invincibility, hardened in the blitzkriegs of Poland, France, and the Balkans, crumbled with every mile lost. Officers barked orders to hold positions, but the sight of endless Soviet reinforcements and the bitter sting of the cold broke their men's will to fight. Retreat turned into rout. Hitler's orders had been explicit, no step backward, but reality cared nothing for decrees. German units, unable to dig in or regroup, fell back anyway, abandoning supply caches, artillery, even wounded comrades in the snow. The Red Army pressed on, harrying their retreat, striking at their flanks, never allowing the Wehrmacht time to breathe. For the civilians who had endured the occupation, the sight of German retreat was both liberation and horror. Villagers emerged to embrace Soviet soldiers, weeping with relief. Yet they also uncovered the scars left behind. Homes burned to ash, fields salted with destruction, families torn apart by executions and deportations. Liberation carried with it both joy and grief. In just days, the momentum of the entire Eastern Front had shifted. The Wehrmacht, once poised at the gates of Moscow, was now stumbling backward in defeat. The Red Army, once thought broken beyond repair, surged with new strength, reclaiming its land and its pride. The villages of Russia became graveyards for German ambition. And yet, the Soviet advance was not without cost. The Red Army bled for every mile. The snow was marked not only with the tracks of retreating Germans, but with the bodies of Soviet soldiers who had thrown themselves into the fight with unrelenting courage. Their sacrifice ensured that the enemy would not return to Moscow. The drive was more than a counteroffensive. It was the breaking of an illusion, the proof that the tide could turn, that the war in the East would not be decided by one lightning campaign. For the Wehrmacht, the retreat was the bitter taste of reality. For the Soviet Union, it was the first breath of hope. The Germans were reeling, villages were being retaken one after another, and the myth of unstoppable conquest had collapsed in the snow. The Red Army was now on the march, and the Winter War had only just begun. As the Red Army surged from the forests and villages into the snow-covered plains, the German High Command faced a crisis unlike any they had encountered. The Wehrmacht, once the unstoppable force of Europe, now staggered under the relentless Soviet counterattack. Columns of infantry and tanks broke apart in the frozen fields. Supply lines snapped like brittle twigs. Retreat, though desperately needed, was forbidden by a single voice: Adolf Hitler. The Führer, seated far from the battlefield in the warm command centres of East Prussia and Berlin, refused to believe the reality unfolding before his generals. In his mind, Moscow was still within reach. Every report of German units falling back was dismissed as weakness or incompetence. Hitler insisted that the army hold its ground, that not a single metre be surrendered to the Red Army, even as winter and exhaustion crippled his forces. From the outset of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler had taken unprecedented control of military strategy. Now, in the shadow of Moscow, that control became a liability. Field marshals who had planned the initial invasion, who understood the limits of supply and the danger of overextension, found their authority stripped. Orders they had crafted for tactical withdrawal or regrouping were countermanded by telegrams from the Führer himself. The German army, once disciplined and coordinated, became paralyzed by conflicting commands. Communication lines were flooded with directives from Hitler, each more impossible than the last. Units that could have fallen back to defensible positions were forced to stand in open fields, exposed to Soviet artillery and freezing temperatures. Tanks immobilized by snow were left to be abandoned. Starving and frostbitten soldiers were ordered to hold territory with empty rifles. The once respected Wehrmacht now operated under confusion, fear, and frustration. Generals like Fedor von Bock and Heinz Guderian, commanders who had once led lightning campaigns with remarkable efficiency, now found themselves arguing against a Führer who would not yield. Meetings became battlegrounds of words and fury. As officers pleaded for the reality of their situation to be acknowledged, Hitler refused. Retreat was forbidden. Counterattacks, no matter how costly, were demanded. The chaos trickled down to the front lines. German soldiers, already demoralized by frostbite, hunger, and constant Soviet attacks, struggled to interpret contradictory orders. Some units attempted to advance while others were told to hold. Communication breakdowns left entire battalions isolated, encircled, or abandoned in the snow. Artillery shells fell on frozen forests where no German troops remained. The front became a patchwork of panic and disorganization. The refusal to allow retreat turned tactical necessity into catastrophe. When Soviet forces pressed forward, they were often met with disjointed resistance or none at all. German soldiers froze in place, trapped by their own command structure and by the unrelenting cold that had become an ally to the Red Army. Discipline, once the Wehrmacht's hallmark, eroded into confusion and fear. Hitler's obsession with glory and the symbolic capture of Moscow blinded him to the strategic reality. While his troops faltered in the snow, Soviet divisions, especially those freshly arrived from Siberia, coordinated their attacks with precision. Every retreating German unit left behind supplies, weapons, and vehicles, which the Red Army seized and repurposed. The very rigidity that Hitler imposed on his generals became the engine of German defeat. By mid-December, the situation had become a nightmare for German command. Troops frozen, starving, and scattered, units cut off and encircled. Hitler's orders, unrealistic, obsessive, and rigid, ensured that the Wehrmacht would suffer not only from Soviet attacks, but from its own leadership. Chaos at the top translated into chaos on the ground, and the shadow of Moscow's survival grew ever longer. In the end, the Führer's refusal to yield would cost the Germans dearly. The myth of an unstoppable army marching unbroken through Europe would be shattered not just by Soviet resistance but by the inflexibility of its own command. Hitler's hand on the reins of the German army had turned the final approach to Moscow into a disaster. The Red Army, guided by General Zhukov's strategy and Siberian resilience, was poised to exploit every mistake. Chaos reigned in the Wehrmacht, and the once fearsome advance of Operation Barbarossa ground to a freezing, faltering halt. Moscow's gates, once threatened, would not fall, not by man, not by machine, not even by the mind of a dictator. As December deepened, the battle for Moscow was no longer only a struggle of tactics or strategy. It had become a war of endurance against the merciless Russian winter. The land itself was a weapon, indifferent to human ambition. Snow stretched endlessly across the plains, a pristine white landscape hiding devastation, corpses, and shattered dreams. The cold was everywhere, in the soil, in the trees, in the very breath of every soldier caught between survival and annihilation. For the Wehrmacht, winter was a predator. Men froze in the trenches they had once dug with hope, their fingers and toes blackened and numb. Frostbite claimed limbs as decisively as bullets. Entire battalions were immobilized not by Soviet artillery, but by ice that stiffened joints, froze rifle mechanisms, and coated their uniforms with a crust of white that made movement sluggish and clumsy. Every march became agony, every battle a test of human will against nature itself. The battlefield became a graveyard of frozen corpses. Soldiers who had fallen in the fight were left behind, their bodies stiff as boards, their faces etched with shock and fear. Snow drifted over them, hiding them from the living, yet marking the trail of death that stretched for miles. Survivors trudged past these frozen reminders, haunted by the stark reality that in Russia, winter could kill as efficiently as any enemy. Soviet troops, by contrast, were acclimated to the cold. Clad in padded coats and fur-lined boots, they moved across the drifts with the ease of hunters on their home ground. Their weapons functioned in temperatures that immobilized German firearms. Their morale remained intact, hardened by years of Siberian winters, and fueled by the knowledge that the enemy was suffering in conditions they themselves had mastered. Skirmishes in villages and fields were brutal. Snow muffled footsteps but did not silence screams. Infantry clashed in the streets of small towns, bayonets glinting under the pale winter sun. Tanks bogged down in drifts became death traps, vulnerable to mines, anti-tank guns and Soviet artillery. The frozen terrain amplified every danger, every misstep, every error in judgment. Even the simplest tasks became life or death challenges. Supply lines could not reach forward units. Soldiers scavenged for food, ammunition and firewood. Men huddled together at night, breathing into their mittens to keep fingers from falling off. Frostbite and hypothermia were constant companions. Starvation crept silently through the ranks, stealing strength before the bullets could find them. The cold did not discriminate. Generals, privates, horses and mules alike succumbed. Encampments were littered with corpses frozen mid-step, with equipment rendered useless by ice, with the remnants of hastily abandoned positions. Every inch of ground gained was bought with agony, every hour of survival a triumph over the elemental terror that had descended on the front. Amid this relentless brutality, the psychology of the soldiers frayed. German troops, once invincible in their confidence, now trembled at the sight of snowdrifts and the relentless Russian sky. Soviet soldiers, despite fatigue and the constant threat of death, drew strength from the frozen land they knew intimately. They struck with precision, encircled German units, and exploited the enemy's vulnerability to cold and exhaustion. The winter war zone was more than a battlefield, it was a crucible. Only those who could endure the cold, who could fight in sub-zero conditions, who could think and act while frost nipped at their extremities, could survive. The Russians had prepared for this war, trained for this climate, and now they wielded it as effectively as any weapon. The Germans, brilliant in maneuver but unprepared for the ice and snow, were unraveling before the winter itself. By mid-December, the frozen corpses and frostbitten survivors were a grim testament to the toll of the season. Every snow-covered field, every forested ridge, and every village told the story of human endurance stretched to its limits, of an army brought low not just by a determined enemy, but by the merciless hand of nature itself. In the winter of 1941, the fight for Moscow was no longer a simple battle. It had become a struggle for life, where cold, hunger and death stalked every soldier equally. And in this frozen war zone, the Red Army had turned the bitter winter into a weapon wielded with deadly precision against the invaders at their very doorstep. Behind the thunder of artillery and the march of armies, Moscow lived, breathed and endured. The city was not just a strategic prize or a collection of buildings, it was home to millions, each with a story of fear, courage and resilience. From diaries hastily scribbled in the flickering candlelight to letters never sent, the voices of soldiers and civilians reveal the human dimension of the battle for the Soviet capital. A young Soviet soldier, barely 19, wrote in his diary as the German advance neared, "The snow is deep, the cold bites through everything, but we will not yield. I think of my family, my mother, my sister. I will hold this line. If Moscow falls, so do we all." His words, trembling with fear and determination, capture the weight of responsibility each soldier carried, the knowledge that their actions were tied to the fate of a nation. For civilians, the threat was immediate and intimate. Families abandoned homes, fleeing to cellars, factories and crowded trains. Food was scarce, warmth was rarer still. Yet, despite exhaustion and terror, Muscovites volunteered to dig trenches, construct anti-tank barriers, and knit clothing for soldiers at the front. Diaries of ordinary citizens record long nights listening to the distant rumble of artillery, hearts pounding as bombs fell and sirens wailed. One factory worker wrote, "We have not slept in days. Our hands are raw from working the looms, crafting coats for the soldiers. Outside, snowdrifts cover the streets. Every day I pray they will hold, that the boys at the front will push them back." Her words reveal the extraordinary effort of those who were not on the battlefield, yet fought with every ounce of strength they had. Soldiers' letters home echo the stark contrast between youthful idealism and the brutality of reality. A platoon sergeant described freezing trenches, the cries of wounded comrades, and the endless whiteness of the Russian winter. It is silent but not peaceful. Every step is a battle against the cold and fear. Still we fight for Moscow, for our families, for survival. These accounts humanize the front, revealing a war fought not only with strategy and weapons, but with courage and perseverance under impossible conditions. Even German soldiers, caught in the throes of frostbite and retreat, left behind diaries and letters that speak of fear, exhaustion, and disbelief. One Wehrmacht corporal wrote, "We were told Moscow would fall before the snows. We were wrong. The frost pierces our hands, our feet, our hearts. I have seen men die from cold alone. The Russians fight like shadows, unseen and everywhere. I do not know if we will survive." His words underscore the human cost of the campaign, the realization that ambition and ideology could not shield men from the raw cruelty of winter and resistance. In the capital, these voices converged into a chorus of endurance. Children slept beneath makeshift blankets, workers labored to supply the front, and soldiers fought with every breath they could draw. The diaries and letters capture both fear and defiance, despair and hope, painting a vivid picture of life under siege. Historians often measure battles by maps, troop movements, and casualty reports. Yet it is in the personal accounts, the trembling hand writing by candlelight, the whispered prayers in frozen streets, the letters never mailed, that the true cost and heroism of the Battle of Moscow are revealed. Each voice, whether trembling with fear or ringing with determination, tells the story of a city refusing to fall, of people refusing to surrender, and of a nation fighting with every fibre of its being. Through these voices, the human heart of the battle emerges, not just the clash of armies, but the courage of ordinary people, the resilience of a capital under siege, and the unbroken spirit that would ultimately withstand one of history's most harrowing assaults. The diaries, letters, and recollections are more than records. They are testimony to survival, courage, and defiance. They remind us that while armies wage war, it is the people, the soldiers and civilians alike, who endure it, shaping history with every heartbeat in the snow. In the shadow of the German advance, as Moscow trembled on the edge of crisis, another battle raged, not on the snowy plains, not in the forests or streets, but in the hearts and minds of the Soviet people. The struggle for morale became as vital as the struggle for territory. For the Red Army, for the civilians, for the very survival of the Soviet Union, propaganda was no mere tool, it was lifeblood. At the center of this campaign of spirit was Joseph Stalin himself. The man who had survived purges, betrayals, and political upheaval now addressed his nation directly. His radio speeches, broadcast across Moscow and into the front lines, were carefully crafted instruments of resolve. Stalin did not sugarcoat the danger, but he imbued every word with determination. The enemy seeks to destroy our homeland, our people, our soldiers. Our motherland must resist. Moscow will stand. We will fight. We will prevail. These speeches were more than rhetoric. They were anchors in a storm of fear and uncertainty. Citizens huddled around radios in freezing apartments and factories, listening as their leader called for courage and unity. Soldiers in trenches pressed their ear to crackling receivers, finding renewed purpose in every syllable. Morale, fragile and battered, was rebuilt moment by moment, word by word. Music became another weapon in the fight for spirit. Patriotic songs, marching anthems, and choral hymns echoed through streets, barracks, and factories. The stirring notes of the sacred war filled the air, a call to arms that transcended fear. It reminded each listener that they were part of something greater than themselves, a shared struggle for survival and honor. Choirs of civilians sang from cellars and schoolrooms, while soldiers hummed tunes as they trudged through snow and mud, letting rhythm and melody stave off despair. Posters, leaflets, and banners decorated streets and workplaces. Red stars, portraits of Stalin, and exhortations to fight for the motherland became omnipresent reminders of duty and pride. Factories displayed slogans urging workers to increase production for the front, while citizens were encouraged to volunteer, to dig anti-tank ditches, and to sew warm clothing for soldiers. Every visual, every word, every melody worked to fortify the mind against the cold and the enemy alike. Even amidst the chaos of retreat and the horror of winter warfare, this morale campaign took root. Soldiers who had endured frostbite, hunger, and relentless attacks were reminded of the stakes. Moscow was not just a city, it was the beating heart of the nation. Civilians, isolated in freezing apartments or crowded shelters, felt part of a collective effort that mattered. Ordinary people, inspired by speeches and songs, dug trenches, transported supplies, and risked their lives to support the front. Propaganda in Moscow was not a lie, it was a lifeline. It fused the bravery of soldiers with the resilience of civilians, transforming fear into determination. Every broadcast, every song, every poster was a message. The Soviet people would endure. The Soviet people would fight. And above all, the Soviet people would not yield. Even the enemy recognized its potency. German intelligence intercepted broadcasts and reports from Moscow, noting with unease the extraordinary resolve of defenders and civilians alike. Where Hitler saw retreating men and frozen landscapes, Stalin saw the embodiment of collective spirit, a population united against annihilation, willing to endure unimaginable hardship for the survival of their nation. The propaganda of Moscow in 1941 was not simply words or music, it was a weapon of will. It nurtured courage in trenches, hope in shelters, and determination across the frozen streets. It reminded every citizen and every soldier that their struggle was meaningful, their sacrifice vital, and their unity unbreakable. In the heart of winter, in the shadow of a conquering enemy, the Soviet spirit burned brighter than any fire, illuminating the path to survival and eventually victory. While Moscow braced itself against the storm of war, thousands of kilometers away, families in Germany awaited news from the front, unaware of the magnitude of suffering their soldiers endured. Letters, penned by trembling hands and weary minds, became the primary conduit between the Wehrmacht and the world they had left behind. In these words, the story of the Eastern Front, frozen, desperate, and unrelenting, emerges with startling clarity. One corporal, writing to his mother in Cologne, described a reality few at home could comprehend. The snow does not stop. Our feet are black with frostbite. We are running low on food, low on fuel, and our rifles freeze in our hands. The Russians strike without warning. Moscow is not as we were promised. It is far, far away, and each day we are pushed back. His words convey more than hardship. They carry the raw disbelief of men who had believed themselves invincible. Letters from the front reveal the psychological torment that accompanied the physical suffering. Soldiers wrote of fear and confusion, of units cut off from command, of comrades succumbing not to bullets but to hunger, frostbite, and exhaustion. One lieutenant's diary reads, "We were told glory awaited us in the streets of Moscow. Instead, we trudge through endless snow, encircled by an enemy that knows the land better than we ever could. I no longer know if we are winning or losing. I only know we survive hour by hour." The contrast between the Nazi vision of swift conquest and the brutal reality of the Russian winter created a chasm of disbelief. Soldiers who had stormed through Poland, France, and the Balkans with triumph now faced an enemy both human and elemental. The cold became a relentless adversary. The Soviet soldier, trained for the harshest winters, became an almost mythical foe. Men wrote of their shock, of the realization that victory might not be theirs, despite prior experience and superior training. The despair was not only personal but collective. Letters describe abandoned equipment, frozen horses, and convoys immobilized by ice. Entire divisions struggled to maintain cohesion. Soldiers spoke of seeing friends die in silence, their bodies stiffening in the snow. One non-commissioned officer wrote, "We bury them as best we can, but the snow covers everything in silence. There is no time to mourn, only to march, and yet the march seems endless." Even hope was tempered by confusion. Men questioned their orders, their leaders, and the very purpose of the campaign. They grappled with the unthinkable, that the great Wehrmacht, the army that had conquered Europe with such certainty, could falter not only before Moscow, but before the winter itself. Letters repeatedly express a mixture of disbelief and resignation. Disbelief that an enemy once thought weak could resist so fiercely. Resignation that survival depended on endurance more than strategy. Some letters reveal attempts to maintain morale despite reality. Soldiers wrote reassurances to families, hiding despair behind phrases of duty and loyalty. "We will hold," they wrote, even as frostbitten hands and empty stomachs betrayed the truth. These words, half lies and half courage, reflect the profound inner struggle of men caught between ideology, duty, and survival. The German perspective, as captured in these letters and diaries, illuminates the human cost of Operation Barbarossa beyond maps and casualty reports. It shows an army facing the bitter intersection of ambition, winter, and resilient opposition. The tragedy is not only in the loss of men and material, but in the shattering of belief, the realization that the Wehrmacht was not invincible, and that the Russian winter and the Soviet people would exact a toll far greater than any bullet. Through their words, the soldiers reveal fear, endurance, and disbelief. They describe the unimaginable struggle of surviving in a frozen hell, the quiet horror of watching comrades perish, and the slow erosion of hope. These letters are a testament to the human experience of war, offering an unflinching glimpse into the hearts and minds of those caught on the losing side of a battle they thought they would win. As the snow-swept plains outside Moscow became a crucible of human endurance, the eyes of the world turned to the Soviet capital. Reports filtered through governments and newspapers, carrying both alarm and cautious optimism. The defense of Moscow was not merely a Soviet struggle, it was a global event, one that would shape the strategies, morale, and perceptions of nations fighting against Hitler's expanding empire. In London, the British government and press watched the developments with keen interest. Prime Minister Winston Churchill understood the symbolic and strategic importance of Moscow. The city's survival meant that Hitler's Eastern campaign was no longer an unstoppable juggernaut. British newspapers reported with urgency. Headlines highlighted the stubborn Soviet resistance, the bitter winter, and the mounting challenges facing the Wehrmacht. To Britain, a nation still standing against the Luftwaffe, Moscow's defense was both hope and vindication. It suggested that even the most powerful Nazi forces could be slowed, perhaps even stopped, by determination and resilience. Across the Atlantic, the United States followed the unfolding events with both concern and admiration. Although still officially neutral, American officials and journalists recognized that the survival of the Soviet Union was inextricably linked to the broader war effort. Cable reports and dispatches described the Russian winter as a formidable ally to Moscow, and Soviet counterattacks were celebrated in cautious headlines as evidence that Hitler's advance was not invincible. For American policymakers, the defense of Moscow hinted at a crucial shift, that the Eastern Front might become a stalemate, buying time for the Allies to prepare and coordinate their efforts. The Soviet victories, small yet significant, resonated among other Allied nations. From Australia to Canada, the defense of Moscow was read not only as military news but as moral inspiration. Dispatches emphasized civilian heroism, workers in factories, families volunteering for frontline support, and the indomitable spirit of soldiers enduring sub-zero conditions. International audiences were struck by accounts of Siberian divisions arriving to bolster Moscow's defenses, and the remarkable resilience of a population under siege. Churchill personally sent messages of encouragement to Stalin, praising the Soviet people for their courage and fortitude. While diplomatic caution remained, after all, ideological differences still divided the Allies, the defense of Moscow represented a shared strategic and moral victory against Hitler's expansion. It became a narrative of endurance, demonstrating that totalitarian ambition could be resisted, even under the harshest conditions. Beyond governments, global public opinion was swayed. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and magazines recounted the Soviet struggle in vivid detail. Readers learned of frozen trenches, counteroffensives, and heroic acts of ordinary citizens. The defense of Moscow challenged prevailing assumptions about the speed and inevitability of German conquest. To a world watching from afar, the capital's survival became a beacon of hope, a sign that even the seemingly invincible Wehrmacht could be slowed and perhaps eventually defeated. In the diplomatic corridors of Europe and Washington, Moscow's defense shaped strategy. The Allies recognized that if the Soviets could withstand the German onslaught, it would tie down enormous numbers of Wehrmacht divisions, preventing them from reinforcing fronts in Western Europe or North Africa. Moscow's endurance thus became not only a tactical victory for the Red Army, but a geopolitical lever, influencing decisions about supplies, aid, and coordination among nations united against fascism. The defense of Moscow, seen from the outside, was more than a battle. It was a statement. The Soviet Union, long underestimated, had proved it could resist. The global reaction, a mixture of relief, admiration, and cautious calculation, highlighted the capital's central role in the fate of Europe. In the frozen forests and burning villages of Russia, the struggle of a nation reverberated around the world, reminding all that the war was no longer merely a German march of conquest. It was a war of endurance, strategy, and collective will. The world watched, and in watching it learned a critical lesson. Moscow could not fall quietly. Its defense was a turning point not only for the Soviet Union, but for the Allied perception of what Hitler's armies could and could not achieve. In the eyes of the world, the battle for Moscow was no longer a distant eastern conflict. It was a defining moment of hope in the darkest hour of the war. As the smoke of Moscow's outskirts cleared and the bitter winter of 1941 raged on, both Hitler and Stalin were forced to confront the harsh reality of miscalculation. The Battle of Moscow became a crucible not only for soldiers and civilians, but for leadership itself. Each commander, in his own way, had learned lessons forged in snow, blood, and fire, lessons that would shape the remainder of the war. Hitler, confident and obsessive, had underestimated the scope and resilience of Soviet resistance. His initial belief in a lightning campaign, Operation Barbarossa, executed with speed, precision, and ideological zeal, had faltered. The German army was overextended, its supply lines crippled by Rasputitsa mud, frost, and relentless counterattacks. Hitler's refusal to allow tactical withdrawals, his insistence on rigid offensives, and his misjudgment of winter's impact on equipment and men had revealed the limits of his strategic genius. In the harsh lessons of Moscow, he would learn that speed alone could not conquer geography, climate, and a determined population. Hitler's hubris collided with reality. Entire divisions, once symbols of invincibility, lay immobilized in snow or scattered by relentless Soviet pressure. Horses froze where they stood. Tanks became tombs in drifts. Officers pleaded for operational flexibility only to be overruled. The Führer discovered the fatal cost of micromanagement and obsession, and though he would not admit it publicly, the failure outside Moscow marked the first major blow to his reputation of unassailable strategic prowess. Stalin, by contrast, absorbed his own lessons under extreme duress. Purges of the 1930s had hollowed the Red Army's leadership, leaving gaps in experience and command. The initial shock of Barbarossa exposed these vulnerabilities, yet the defense of Moscow demonstrated rapid learning. Stalin recognized the importance of reserves, the mobilization of Siberian divisions trained for winter, and the value of integrating civilian effort with military strategy. He understood that the survival of the capital depended not only on numbers, but on logistics, morale, and flexible adaptive command. The Soviets learned to exploit both the environment and enemy miscalculations. Winter, once feared as a potential handicap, became an ally. Frontline commanders gained autonomy to respond to rapidly shifting situations. Trains moved industry eastward, ensuring sustained production. Civilians fortified the city, dug anti-tank ditches, and maintained morale under the guidance of propaganda. Stalin realized that success in defense required more than ideology. It demanded practical adaptation, coordination, and an unbreakable will. From Moscow, the lessons radiated outward, reshaping strategy on both sides. German generals began to question orders from Berlin, struggling to reconcile doctrinal rigidity with battlefield reality. Stalin, once hesitant, became more decisive, learning to balance central authority with the initiative of commanders on the front. Both leaders confronted the consequences of overconfidence, misjudgment, and the immense unpredictability of war on the Eastern Front. In hindsight, the defense of Moscow was not just a tactical victory. It was an education in the art of modern warfare under extreme conditions. For Hitler, it was a lesson in the limits of ideology-driven strategy and the dangers of ignoring environmental factors. For Stalin, it was a lesson in mobilizing a nation, learning from mistakes, and harnessing the full spectrum of military, civilian, and industrial resources to defend a capital. The battle also underscored the broader principle that war is rarely won through brilliance alone. Luck, timing, logistics, climate, and morale could all tip the scales. Miscalculations, whether underestimating winter, overestimating speed, or underappreciating the enemy's resilience, carried immense consequences. By the time both leaders had internalized these lessons, the Eastern Front had entered a new phase, one in which strategy, adaptation, and endurance would define the course of history. For Hitler and Stalin alike, Moscow was a proving ground. It revealed flaws and strengths, exposed hubris and ingenuity, and forced a reckoning with reality. The shifting strategies born from this crucible would echo through the remainder of the war, shaping campaigns, dictating command decisions, and defining the fates of millions. As the winter of 1941 gripped the Russian landscape in an icy embrace, Moscow teetered on the edge of annihilation. The German war machine, once unstoppable, had advanced perilously close to the city, and yet, against all odds, the Soviet capital survived. Its survival was not simply a tactical victory, it was the lifeline that kept the Soviet Union, and indeed the Allied war effort, alive. Had Moscow fallen, the consequences would have been catastrophic. The symbolic heart of the Soviet Union, the center of government, military command, and industrial capacity, would have been lost. The psychological impact on soldiers and civilians alike could have shattered morale, creating chaos across a nation already tested by surprise invasion, encirclements, and winter's unforgiving grip. But Moscow endured, fortified by strategic foresight, civilian resilience, and the indomitable will of its defenders. The arrival of Siberian divisions, hardened by years of frigid winters, proved decisive. These troops brought not only skill but a morale boost to exhausted frontline units. Under General Zhukov's strategic guidance, the Red Army launched counterattacks that pushed back the overextended Wehrmacht. Villages and towns were reclaimed, supply lines disrupted, and the advancing German army forced into retreat. Moscow's survival became both a beacon and a bulwark, a tangible manifestation of Soviet resilience. Civilians had played an indispensable role. Workers labored around the clock, factories churned out weapons, trenches and anti-tank obstacles were built, and volunteer brigades supported the front lines. The people of Moscow had transformed the city into a fortress, their combined effort magnifying the strength of the Red Army. Diaries, letters, and eyewitness accounts reveal a population determined to endure, to resist, and to protect the heart of their homeland. The survival of Moscow ensured continuity of command, enabling Stalin and the High Command to orchestrate strategic responses that would shape the remainder of the war. Communication lines remained intact, critical industries continued to produce, and reserves could be marshaled effectively. In short, the Soviet Union retained the organizational and operational capacity necessary to withstand the Wehrmacht and to fight another day. Globally, Moscow's endurance sent a powerful message. Allies in Britain, the United States, and beyond saw proof that Hitler's Eastern campaign could be halted. The psychological shock of a stalled German advance invigorated resistance movements, inspired hope in embattled populations, and reassured policymakers that the Soviet Union remained a viable and formidable partner in the struggle against fascism. Moscow's survival also marked a turning point in the narrative of World War II, where once the Wehrmacht had seemed invincible, now doubt and fear crept into German ranks. Soldiers, previously confident, confronted the bitter reality of frostbite, starvation, and relentless Soviet resistance. Commanders realized that overextension, misjudged timing, and underestimating the enemy could bring even the greatest armies to their knees. The defense of Moscow, culminating in counteroffensives that reclaimed territory and inflicted severe casualties on the Germans, preserved not just a city, but the very heart of a nation. It transformed a moment of near collapse into a story of endurance, resilience, and strategic brilliance. The Soviet Union had survived its darkest hour, proving that determination, unity, and adaptation could overcome even the most formidable threats. From the brink of destruction, Moscow became a symbol of survival and hope. It embodied the courage of soldiers and civilians, the strategic acumen of commanders, and the enduring spirit of a nation refusing to yield. Its survival ensured that the Soviet Union remained in the war, capable of shaping the course of history, resisting tyranny and eventually turning the tide against Hitler's forces. The snow of 1941 has long since melted, but the echoes of Moscow's defense continue to reverberate through history. The Battle of Moscow was more than a clash of armies. It was a test of human endurance, courage, and the unyielding spirit of a nation confronted by annihilation. In the frozen forests, snow-covered fields, and streets of the capital, ordinary people and soldiers alike forged a story whose impact would stretch far beyond the front lines. The battle revealed the resilience of the Soviet people. Soldiers braved frostbite, hunger, and relentless assaults, while civilians labored tirelessly to fortify their city, transport supplies, and sustain morale. Diaries, letters, and first-hand accounts testify to the extraordinary collective effort, from factory floors to trenches, from anti-tank obstacles to volunteer brigades. Courage was not the exclusive domain of generals or strategists. It belonged to every man, woman, and child who faced winter. Bombardment and fear with steadfast resolve. For Hitler, the Battle of Moscow was a profound turning point. The Wehrmacht, once a symbol of invincibility, had been halted by an enemy they underestimated, by terrain and winter they had ignored, and by a people whose determination could not be crushed. The dream of a swift conquest of the Soviet Union, of a victorious blitzkrieg ending before the snows, began to crumble before the capital's gates. The failure at Moscow marked the beginning of a long and costly attritional struggle in the East, one that would eventually exhaust German resources and willpower. Strategically, the battle reshaped the Eastern Front. Soviet forces had learned to integrate winter warfare, civilian effort, and tactical counteroffensives. Commanders like Zhukov emerged with reputations solidified by brilliance under pressure. Stalin's leadership, tempered by initial miscalculations and the purges of the 1930s, evolved to combine flexibility with ruthlessness. Moscow's survival preserved the operational heart of the Soviet Union, ensuring that the nation could continue to produce, organize, and field armies capable of confronting and ultimately defeating the Wehrmacht. Globally, Moscow's defense became a symbol of resistance and hope. Allied nations, watching from afar, saw that Hitler could be resisted, that the tide of conquest was not inevitable. Propaganda, morale, and diplomacy intertwined to create a psychological impact far beyond the battlefield. For the Soviet Union, the victory, even one hard-won and incomplete, served as proof that endurance and unity could overcome even the most formidable odds. The human cost was immense. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost, cities were battered, and the land itself scarred by combat and winter's fury. Yet in those frozen fields and devastated streets, the essence of resilience was immortalized. Moscow's defense demonstrated that even the darkest hour could be transformed into a moment of courage and determination that altered the trajectory of a global conflict. The Battle of Moscow stands as a testament to the power of collective will, strategic adaptation, and the unbreakable human spirit. It was the first great failure of Hitler's Eastern campaign, the first signal that ideology, ambition, and military might alone could not guarantee victory. It was a battle that defined the course of World War II in the East, preserving a nation, inspiring a people, and reshaping history. In remembering Moscow, we remember more than military maneuvers or statistics. We remember endurance in the face of annihilation, courage in the shadow of despair, and the profound truth that even against overwhelming odds, determination and unity can turn the tide. The legacy of the Battle of Moscow is eternal, a moment when the dream of conquest faltered and the hope of survival and eventual triumph burned brighter than ever.